On my way home for Thanksgiving, I crashed and needed emergency surgery for broken ribs and internal bleeding. My parents told the doctor we will come if she dies. I woke up alone until a hospital clerk handed me a wrapped box. She said the man in the black jacket paid your bill and said not to open it until you get home. My name is Sydney, and I am 31 years old. If you have ever been the scapegoat in a family that cares more about social status than your actual life, you know exactly how cold the world can feel. But what my parents did not know was that the box sitting on my hospital bed was about to give me the power to send every single one of them to federal prison. Growing up in the wealthy Buckhead neighborhood of Atlanta, my family was the absolute picture of the black elite. My father, Calvin, was the charismatic director of a massive community housing charity, and my mother, Brenda, was the ultimate socialite who ruled the local country club. They were obsessed with maintaining a flawless public image. I was always the problem child because I refused to play their fake games. I pursued a quiet career as a senior corporate compliance officer, analyzing financial documents and ensuring regulatory laws were followed. My parents constantly belittled my job, calling it boring and broke. They saved all their pride and affection for my younger sister Jasmine, who they considered the golden child. Jasmine was beautiful, obedient, and entirely focused on climbing the social ladder. Her greatest achievement in my parents' eyes was marrying Connor. Connor was a wealthy, arrogant white man who masqueraded as a brilliant tech entrepreneur and venture capitalist. From the moment Connor entered our family, my parents worshipped him. They treated him like a white savior who brought diverse elite connections and massive wealth into their inner circle. They allowed Connor to dictate family dynamics and make condescending jokes about my humble lifestyle. They were so blinded by his money that they would gladly step over my bleeding body just to secure another donation from his wealthy friends. I learned exactly how true that was when I woke up in the intensive care unit. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound greeting me as I drifted back into consciousness. My entire body felt like it had been crushed under the weight of a freight train. Every breath I took sent a searing, agonizing pain through my chest. I blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights, trying to piece together the fragmented memories of the crash. The screeching tires, the shattering glass, the violent impact that sent my small sedan spinning off the highway. I turned my head slowly, wincing, as the stiff neck brace dug into my skin. The room was empty. There were no flowers on the bedside table. There were no frantic family members holding my hand. There was just the sterile smell of alcohol and the cold reality of my total isolation. A young nurse with kind brown eyes walked into the room to check my intravenous line. When she saw that I was awake, her shoulders dropped in relief, but a deep, profound sadness immediately clouded her expression. She introduced herself as Maya and gently explained the extent of my injuries. 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and severe internal bleeding that had required an emergency operation. I listened to her words while scanning the room again, hoping that my parents were just in the cafeteria or talking to a doctor in the hallway. I asked her if my family was on their way. Maya looked down at her clipboard, avoiding my gaze. She bit her lip, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. I pushed through the pain and demanded to know what was wrong. That was when she told me about the phone call. She explained that when I first arrived in the trauma bay, my blood pressure was dropping dangerously low. The surgical team needed immediate consent to operate. They found my phone and dialed the emergency contact numbers for my parents. Maya told me that the doctor put the call on speakerphone because they were actively performing emergency procedures to keep me alive. My father answered the phone, and when the doctor frantically explained that his daughter had been in a catastrophic car accident, my mother snatched the receiver. Maya repeated my mother's exact words with a trembling voice. "We are hosting the Thanksgiving Gala for the elite families of Atlanta right now, and Sydney always pulls these dramatic stunts for attention, so just call us back if she actually dies." Maya apologized to me, her voice breaking as she said nobody should ever have to hear their own mother say something so incredibly cruel. I did not cry. I just stared at the blank white ceiling of the hospital room, letting the absolute finality of those words sink deep into my bones. Call us back if she actually dies. It was not a shock, it was a confirmation. I was nothing to them. My life was completely worthless compared to their social standing and their desperate need to impress Connor and his wealthy associates. The physical pain in my chest was blinding, but the emotional clarity was empowering. I realized I owed them nothing. I had spent years trying to earn the love of people who would gladly let me bleed to death to avoid interrupting a dinner party. The door to my room opened again, interrupting my dark thoughts. A hospital billing clerk stepped inside, carrying a square box wrapped in plain brown paper. She looked around nervously before approaching my bed. She placed the box gently on my lap and leaned in close to whisper. She told me that a man wearing a dark black jacket had come to the billing department an hour ago. He paid my entire medical bill in cash, a sum totaling over $120,000. He refused to give his name or leave any contact information. He simply handed the clerk this box and told her to deliver it to me as soon as I woke up. The clerk repeated his strict warning. He said to tell you not to open this box until you are safely inside your own apartment, behind locked doors. I stared at the brown paper package resting heavily against my legs. A stranger had paid a fortune to save my life while my own flesh and blood told the doctors to let me die. My compliance officer instincts kicked into high gear. This was not a random act of charity. This was a calculated move by someone who knew exactly who I was and exactly what had happened to me. The crash on the highway suddenly did not feel like a tragic accident anymore. It felt like a message. I thanked the clerk and asked Maya to help me sit up. Every movement was sheer agony, but I gritted my teeth and pushed through the pain. I told Maya I was leaving. She protested strongly, warning me that I needed at least another week of observation, but I refused to listen. I signed the discharge papers against medical advice, ignoring the concerned protests of the nursing staff. I could barely breathe without a sharp stabbing pain piercing my right side, but adrenaline was slowly replacing the shock. I hailed a cab outside the hospital, clutching the brown paper box to my chest like a shield. The ride back to my apartment building was a blur of flashing streetlights and paranoid glances over my shoulder. Every time a large vehicle drove too close to the cab, my heart hammered against my fractured ribs. The stranger in the black jacket had specifically told me to wait until I was behind locked doors, and I intended to follow his instructions perfectly. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the deadbolt, slid the chain into place, and collapsed onto my living room sofa. The silence of my small apartment was usually comforting, but tonight it felt heavy with anticipation. I took a pair of scissors and carefully sliced through the brown paper wrapping of the box. Inside, resting on a bed of dark foam, were three distinct items. The first was a cheap prepaid burner phone. The second was a heavy encrypted metal flash drive. The third item made my stomach drop and my blood run cold. It was a physical piece of a thick black rubber tube covered in dark greasy fluid. It smelled strongly of chemical lubricants. Even with my limited knowledge of cars, I knew exactly what I was looking at. It was a severed segment of a vehicle brake line. My hands trembled as I picked up the encrypted flash drive and plugged it into my laptop. The drive automatically opened a single video file. I clicked play and held my breath. The footage was grainy at first, but quickly focused into a clear view of my apartment building's parking garage. The timestamp in the corner indicated it was recorded late Tuesday night, just hours before I started my drive home for Thanksgiving. The camera angle was hidden discreetly in the shadows, capturing the exact parking spot where I kept my sedan. A figure dressed in dark clothing approached my car. The person looked around to ensure the garage was empty before sliding underneath the front driver's side wheel well. The video zoomed in, and the harsh glare of a garage security light illuminated the side of the person's face. It was Connor, my wealthy, arrogant white brother-in-law. I watched in absolute horror as the man my parents worshipped pulled a specialized cutting tool from his pocket and methodically sliced through my brake lines. He was careful, calculated, and entirely unbothered. He wiped his hands on a rag, smiled at his handiwork, and walked away into the darkness. The video ended, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the dark screen of my laptop. Connor had tried to murder me. He had deliberately sabotaged my car, knowing I would be driving on the busy interstate highway for Thanksgiving. The crash was not a tragic twist of fate, it was an assassination attempt. The air in my lungs felt trapped. I struggled to pull in a breath as the reality of the situation washed over me. Why would Connor want me dead? I was just a compliance officer who lived a quiet life. I barely spoke to him at family gatherings because I could not stand his condescending remarks. We had no personal relationship, no financial ties, and no direct conflicts outside of mutual dislike. Before I could process the shock any further, the cheap burner phone sitting in the box suddenly rang. The sharp electronic tone shattered the silence in my apartment. I stared at the flashing screen for a long moment. Before picking it up and pressing the answer button, I brought the phone to my ear but did not say a word. I just waited, listening to the steady breathing on the other end of the line. A deep, gravelly voice finally broke the silence. He asked me if I liked his Thanksgiving present. I demanded to know who he was and how he got that footage. The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that sent a shiver down my spine. He told me his name was Elias, and that he was the man who had just paid my hospital bill. He said he had been watching Connor for a very long time, waiting for the right moment to tear his life apart. Elias told me that Connor did not just try to kill me because he hated me. He tried to kill me because of what I was assigned to audit next Monday. I froze. Next Monday, I was scheduled to begin a routine compliance audit for a major federal diversity grant program. It was a standard assignment, reviewing the allocation of government funds meant to support minority-owned businesses in the Atlanta area. I asked Elias what the audit had to do with my brother-in-law. Elias explained that the Thanksgiving gala my parents were hosting tonight was not just a fancy dinner for the black elite, it was a cover. At that gala, Connor was going to publicly sign the paperwork to secure a $50 million federal diversity grant. Elias laid out the entire scheme with chilling precision. Connor had created a fake technology startup using my sister Jasmine as the minority founder to qualify for the federal grant. He was leveraging the massive social influence of my parents' charity to legitimize the project in the eyes of the community and the government. But Connor had no intention of building a technology company. He was going to funnel the $50 million into his own offshore shell companies while leaving my sister and my parents to take the fall when the government eventually realized the money was gone. Connor knew that I was the senior compliance officer assigned to audit the final approval of that specific grant. He knew that I was meticulous and that I would never approve a fraudulent application no matter who was involved. He knew that my integrity could not be bought, so he decided to eliminate the problem permanently. He cut my brakes, hoping I would die on the highway before Monday morning. Elias asked me a question that stopped my heart. He asked if I honestly believed my parents did not know about the money. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to scream that my parents were flawed and selfish but not criminals. However, the memory of my mother's voice echoing through the hospital trauma bay returned to my mind. Call us back if she actually dies. They did not care that I was bleeding to death because they were too busy securing their piece of a $50 million fraud. They valued Connor and his stolen wealth more than my life. Elias told me that tonight was the final night to stop them. If Connor signed the papers at the gala, the money would vanish overseas by tomorrow morning, and the legal trail would be completely obscured. Elias asked me directly if I was going to hide in my apartment and lick my wounds, or if we were going to crash a gala tonight. I looked at the severed brake line resting on my coffee table. I thought about the agonizing pain shooting through my broken ribs. I thought about the years I spent being treated like a worthless stepping stone for my family to climb towards social prominence. A cold, calculating rage began to replace the fear in my heart. I told Elias I was not going to hide. I asked him what he needed me to do. The conversation with Elias continued as I paced the small layout of my apartment, carefully managing my breathing to avoid aggravating my broken ribs. I needed to understand exactly who I was dealing with before I walked into a room full of powerful people. I asked Elias why he cared about Connor and why he was willing to spend over $100,000 to save a stranger. Elias was silent for a moment before he revealed his own backstory. He told me that 5 years ago he had built a revolutionary financial technology company from the ground up. He was brilliant, but he lacked the elite social connections needed to secure massive institutional funding. That was when Connor entered his life. Connor played the role of the wealthy white investor who wanted to help a promising black entrepreneur succeed. Connor promised to introduce Elias to all the right people and help him scale the business. Instead, Connor orchestrated a hostile takeover. He fabricated evidence of financial mismanagement, framed Elias for corporate fraud, and forced him out of his own company. Connor used his wealth and his privileged status to paint Elias as an incompetent and corrupt founder, ruining Elias' reputation completely. Elias lost everything. His company, his money, and his good name were all stolen by the man who was currently married to my sister. But Elias did not disappear. He spent the last 5 years working with federal authorities, becoming a highly confidential whistleblower and informant. He had been tracking Connor's financial movements, waiting for him to make a mistake large enough to trigger a federal indictment. The $50 million diversity grant was that mistake. Connor was using my parents' charity as a money laundering front, utilizing their tax-exempt status to clean the stolen funds before moving them offshore. Elias explained that he had the federal agents ready and waiting, but they needed the ultimate proof. They needed Connor to publicly present the fraudulent documents at the gala, connecting the charity, my sister, and the offshore accounts in one undeniable moment. But more importantly, Elias needed an insider, an authorized financial compliance officer, to legally verify the fraud in real time, to secure the immediate arrest warrants. He needed me. I ended the call with Elias after memorizing the exact address of the hotel where the gala was being held. I walked into my bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, and a large purple bruise covered the left side of my jaw. My chest was wrapped in thick hospital bandages, and every movement felt like knives digging into my flesh. The physical toll of the crash was immense, but the emotional clarity I felt was sharper than a razor. My family had actively participated in my attempted murder by enabling the man who cut my brakes. They had sold their souls and my life for a taste of elite wealth. I opened my medicine cabinet and swallowed the maximum allowed dose of the heavy pain medication the hospital had prescribed. I needed to be sharp, but I also needed to be able to stand up straight without collapsing in agony. I opened my closet and bypassed the muted gray and black business suits I normally wore to the office. Tonight, I was not going to blend into the background. Tonight, I was going to be the center of attention. I reached into the back of the closet and pulled out a stunning tailored crimson-red suit. It was bold, aggressive, and impossible to ignore. It was the color of war and the color of the blood I had shed on that hospital bed. Dressing myself was a slow, torturous process. Pulling the tailored trousers over my legs and maneuvering my arms into the fitted blazer brought tears of pain to my eyes. I refused to let the tears fall. I used thick medical tape to bind my ribs even tighter, restricting my breathing, but providing the stability I needed to walk upright. I applied heavy foundation to conceal the dark bruising on my jaw and painted my lips a deep matching shade of red. When I looked in the mirror again, the broken, bleeding victim was gone. Staring back at me was a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to destroy. I walked back to my living room and picked up my laptop, using my high-level federal clearance credentials. I accessed the secure government server and downloaded the preliminary files for the diversity grant application Connor had submitted. I transferred the encrypted dashcam footage of Connor cutting my brakes, along with the grant files, onto 2 separate secure flash drives. I placed one flash drive in the inner pocket of my crimson blazer. I took the second flash drive and the physical piece of the severed rubber brake line and placed them carefully inside my designer clutch purse. My phone, which had been silent since the crash, suddenly chimed with a text message. It was from the family group chat. My sister Jasmine had sent a picture of herself standing in front of a mirror, wearing a dazzling diamond necklace with the caption, "Ready to be crowned the Queen of Atlanta Tech tonight." Below her picture, my mother had sent a message complaining about the catering staff at the hotel. There was absolutely no mention of my accident. No one asked if I was alive. No one cared that there was an empty seat at their table. I stared at the screen, letting the cold reality of their indifference fuel the fire burning in my chest. They were happily preparing to celebrate a fraudulent victory funded by stolen money and my potential death. I typed out a response, my thumbs moving quickly over the glass screen. I wrote, "Heard you were worried about me. Do not start the celebration yet. I am on my way." I hit send and watched the message appear in the chat. I did not wait to see their responses. I turned off my phone, slipped it into my purse, and walked out the door of my apartment. The pain in my chest was a constant, agonizing reminder of what I had survived, but it was completely overshadowed by the singular focus of my mission. I was walking into the lion's den, but I was bringing the fire that would burn it all to the ground. The heavy mahogany doors of the downtown Atlanta Four Seasons ballroom stood between me and the people who wanted me dead. I pushed them open with my good shoulder, stepping into a sea of silk and tailored tuxedos. The annual Thanksgiving Gala was in full swing. This was the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta Black elite society. Mayors, councilmen, mega-church pastors, and real estate moguls mingled under cascading crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with the scent of expensive imported perfume and roasted heavy meats. A live jazz band was playing a smooth, low-tempo melody in the corner. I walked forward, the heels of my shoes sinking slightly into the plush carpet. The vibrant crimson red of my suit was a stark contrast to the muted, elegant tones of the room. It did not take long for people to notice me. The low hum of polite networking and wealthy laughter began to die down nearest to the entrance. Heads turned in my direction. The jazz band seemed to falter for a fraction of a second, missing a beat as the lead saxophonist caught sight of my bruised jaw and aggressive red suit. I kept my posture perfectly straight, ignoring the excruciating fire burning through my broken ribs with every step I took. The crowd slowly parted, forming a path that led directly to the front of the ballroom, where the primary VIP table was situated. Sitting at that table in the center of all the glittering excess were my parents. My father, Wallace, was wearing a custom-tailored velvet tuxedo, laughing loudly at a joke told by a city official. My mother, Vivian, sat beside him, dripping in diamonds that were undoubtedly paid for with stolen tithe money. Her hair was styled into an immaculate, flawless updo. She held a crystal flute of champagne, projecting the ultimate image of the gracious, holy, and wealthy First Lady of their massive congregation. I watched the exact second her eyes locked onto mine. The champagne flute slipped slightly in her hand, spilling a few drops of expensive liquor onto the pristine white tablecloth. Her eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. Wallace noticed her reaction and followed her gaze. The charming pastoral smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer panic. They truly believed I was lying in a hospital bed attached to monitors or dying from internal bleeding. Seeing me standing there alive and breathing was their worst nightmare, brought to life in front of 500 elite witnesses. Vivian did not hesitate. She slammed her glass down on the table and stood up. She plastered a massive fake smile onto her face for the benefit of the surrounding guests, nodding and waving as she moved swiftly away from the VIP section and marched directly toward me. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor of the center aisle. She closed the distance between us like a predator zeroing in on a threat. When she reached me, she did not stop to ask how I was feeling. She did not ask if my punctured lung had healed or if the doctors had managed to stop the bleeding. Instead, she reached out with her manicured hands and grabbed my left arm. She dug her acrylic nails directly into the darkest purple bruise hiding beneath my crimson sleeve. A blinding flash of white-hot agony shot through my torso, making my vision blur for a second. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself not to flinch or show any sign of physical weakness in front of the watching crowd. Her voice was a venomous whisper, completely at odds with the wide, artificial smile still plastered across her face. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her breath smelling of mint and alcohol. "You look absolutely insane, Sydney. Look at your face. You are covered in bruises and you are wearing a cheap red suit to a black tie event. You are embarrassing this family just like you always do. I told the hospital to keep you there because you are clearly having another one of your mental episodes." I tried to pull my arm away, but she tightened her grip, her nails digging deeper into my bruised flesh. "You need to turn around right now," she whispered furiously. "Go down the side hallway and leave through the kitchen service exit where nobody else can see you. You are not going to ruin this night for us." Connor is about to sign the final paperwork for a $50 million federal grant that will secure our legacy forever. We are on the verge of making history, and I will not let your toxic jealousy destroy the biggest financial deal of our lives. Get out of here before I call hospital security to drag you back to the psych ward. I let her finish her frantic gaslighting. I let her pour every ounce of her narcissistic venom into the space between us. Then I slowly raised my right hand and clamped my fingers over her wrist. I squeezed hard, finding the pressure just below her expensive diamond bracelet. Vivian gasped quietly, her fake smile slipping as I coldly and methodically removed her hand from my injured arm. I leaned in close enough that she could see the absolute lack of emotion in my eyes. "I am not going to the kitchen, Mother," I said, my voice perfectly level and terrifyingly calm. "I just survived a car crash that shattered my ribs and tore open my organs. I am exhausted, I am in pain, and frankly, I am incredibly hungry." I looked past her shoulder directly at the massive floral centerpiece sitting on her table. "I am not leaving this ballroom. I want my assigned seat at the VIP table, and I want a glass of ice water." Vivian's face turned an ashy shade of gray. She opened her mouth to argue, but the sudden shift in the room's power dynamic had completely paralyzed her. She realized in that moment that her usual tactics of verbal abuse and physical intimidation were no longer working. I was not the obedient scapegoat daughter who would shrink away in shame just to protect her fragile social standing. I took a deliberate step forward, forcing her to step backward to avoid colliding with me. From the corner of my eye, I noticed a shift at the VIP table. The commotion had finally caught the attention of the man who orchestrated my near-fatal accident. Preston stood up from his chair, smoothing the lapels of his custom midnight blue suit. He held a heavy crystal glass filled with dark amber scotch. His blonde hair was swept back flawlessly, complementing his arrogant, entitled posture. He looked at Vivian panicking in the aisle, and then his cold, pale eyes locked onto mine. He did not look shocked to see me alive. He looked annoyed, like I was a persistent insect that had survived a swatting. Preston offered a few reassuring words to the politicians sitting near him before stepping away from the table. He sauntered down the aisle toward us, moving with the effortless, condescending grace of a wealthy white man who believed he owned every room he walked into. A smug, patronizing smile spread slowly across his face as he prepared to assert his dominance and put his unstable black sister-in-law back in her rightful place. He moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who believed the world was built entirely for his convenience. The ambient light of the crystal chandeliers caught the expensive fabric of his suit as he closed the remaining distance between us. The elite guests of Atlanta, who had been holding their breath just moments ago, immediately relaxed as they watched him approach. In their eyes, Preston was the stabilizing force. He was the wealthy savior descending from his pedestal to handle a minor domestic disturbance. I watched the artificial warmth flood his pale face. He flashed a brilliant, dazzling smile toward the nearby city council members, making a subtle, placating gesture with his free hand to assure them that everything was under control. It was a masterful performance. He stopped right in front of me, standing uncomfortably close to use his height as a physical advantage. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sharp bite of the amber liquor in his crystal glass. He looked down at me, his eyes sweeping over the bruised skin on my jaw and the rigid posture I held to keep my broken ribs from screaming. There was no shock in his expression. There was only a profound, arrogant amusement. He tilted his head, adopting the faux concerned expression of a saint, forced to deal with a difficult charity case. "Well, Sydney," he said, his voice projecting just loud enough for the closest tables to hear. "We certainly were not expecting you to join us tonight, especially given your condition." He reached into the inner pocket of his midnight blue jacket and smoothly withdrew a crisp $100 bill. The crisp sound of the paper folding between his fingers echoed over the low jazz music playing in the background. He held the money out to me, extending his arm so that the entire room could witness his grand gesture of false generosity. His smile remained frozen in place, but the look in his cold eyes was completely devoid of any human empathy. "Take this and go find yourself an Uber home, Sydney," he said, projecting that same sickeningly sweet tone of voice. You need to buy yourself some heavy medication and get some sleep because you are clearly unwell. You look completely unstable right now, and we both know how poorly that reflects on you. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a harsh, aggressive whisper meant only for my ears. The smell of scotch washed over my face. Do not play games with me tonight. He breathed his words, cutting through the air like a razor. You are standing in a room full of people who already think you are a jealous, bitter woman who cannot handle her sister's success. If you do not turn around and walk out of those doors, right this second, I will signal my private security team to drag you out by your hair. I will tell the hotel manager that the angry, unstable black woman is having a violent psychological breakdown. I will have you strapped to a gurney and thrown into a psychiatric ward before the first course of this dinner is even served. Nobody in this room will question me. Your own parents will sign the commitment papers themselves just to keep you quiet. So take the cash turnaround and crawl back to whatever miserable hole you crawled out of. The blatant racial trope and the threat of forced institutionalization were designed to trigger an emotional explosion. Preston wanted me to scream. He wanted me to raise my voice, flail my arms, and give him the exact stereotype he needed to justify having me physically removed from the gala. He wanted to be the victim of my supposed madness. I refused to give him a single ounce of satisfaction. I stood my ground, planting my feet firmly against the thick carpet. My heart hammered violently against the tight medical tape binding my ribs, but my face remained an impenetrable mask of absolute calm. I did not look at the $100 bill hovering in the space between us. Instead, I maintained unbroken eye contact with him. The confident smirk on his face began to waver slightly as the seconds stretched on in complete silence. He was waiting for the inevitable breakdown that never came. I slowly raised my right hand, moving with deliberate and fluid precision. I ignored his outstretched hand holding the cash and instead reached directly for the heavy crystal glass resting in his other hand. My fingers brushed against his knuckles as I smoothly slid the glass of scotch out of his loose grip. Preston blinked in genuine confusion, momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity of the action. I brought the crystal rim to my red lips, taking my eyes off him for only a fraction of a second. The dark amber liquid burned a hot trail down my throat, momentarily warming the deep ache settling into my chest. The expensive scotch was smooth and smoky, exactly what a man who thought he had gotten away with murder would drink to celebrate. I lowered the glass and held it delicately in my hand, feeling the cool condensation gathering on the crystal. I took a half step forward, invading his personal space just as he had done to me moments earlier. I leaned in close enough that my lips almost brushed the lapel of his tailored suit jacket. My voice was softer than a whisper, carrying a lethal coldness that sliced straight through his arrogant bravado. Exactly 3.4 ounces, I murmured, staring directly into the pale expanse of his neck. Preston stiffened his entire body, going rigid. He tried to lean back, but the dense crowd behind him left him nowhere to retreat. "What the hell are you talking about?" he hissed, the fake charm completely vanishing from his tone. I tilted my head up, meeting his sudden look of rising panic with a deadpan stare. "I am talking about the exact amount of heavy synthetic brake fluid that pooled onto the concrete floor of my apartment garage," I whispered, letting the words hang heavily in the air between us. "You were very efficient, Preston, but you left a puddle. 3.4 ounces of chemical lubricant leaking from a severed rubber tube while you wiped your hands on a gray rag and smiled directly into a hidden dashboard camera. The blood drained entirely from Preston's face, leaving him looking like a hollow white ghost under the glowing chandeliers. The sharp, confident lines of his jaw went slack and his eyes widened in absolute terror. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. He understood in that exact second that I was not here to throw a jealous tantrum or beg for my parents' attention. He realized that the compliance officer he had tried to slaughter in cold blood was standing in front of him, holding a glass of his own scotch and possessing absolute irrefutable proof of his crimes. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The smooth-talking venture capitalist was suddenly rendered entirely speechless. I watched his throat bob as he swallowed hard, trying to process the magnitude of the trap he had just walked into. The $50 million federal grant, the elite social standing, the offshore bank accounts, everything he had built his fraudulent empire upon was currently dangling by a single thread that I held firmly in my bruised hands. Before Preston could recover enough to formulate a single coherent lie, the sharp, piercing sound of high heels aggressively striking the marble floor cut through the tension. The crowd parted once again, and this time they moved faster. Ebony was marching down the center aisle looking like a furious goddess wrapped in emerald green silk. The heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone caught the light flashing brightly with her every angry step. She had watched the entire exchange from the VIP table, and her fragile ego could no longer handle the fact that every single important investor in the room was staring at her battered older sister instead of her. Ebony pushed past a prominent city councilman without apologizing. Her eyes locked onto me with pure, unadulterated hatred. She was furious that the spotlight had been stolen from her on the night she was supposed to be crowned the Queen of Atlanta Tech. Ebony stopped right beside Preston, her emerald green silk dress rustling against the thick carpet. The heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone caught the light from the chandeliers flashing brightly with every angry, shallow breath she took. She did not even glance at the massive purple bruise covering the side of my jaw. She did not notice the stiff, unnatural way I was holding my posture to keep my shattered ribs from shifting. Her eyes were completely blind to my physical trauma because she was entirely consumed by her own narcissistic rage. She stepped directly into my personal space, her expensive floral perfume, masking the faint scent of medical tape and antiseptic that still clung to my skin. She hissed at me, asking what kind of sick joke I was trying to pull by showing up to the most important night of her life, looking like a battered street rat. She told me I was pathetic. She said I was nothing but a bitter, underachieving government worker who could never stand to see her younger sister thrive. Tonight was supposed to be her crowning achievement, she reminded me, her voice vibrating with venom. In less than an hour, the mayor of Atlanta was going to call her up to the main stage and present her with the Black Female Founder of the Year award. She told me I was deliberately trying to sabotage her moment in the spotlight because my own life was empty and meaningless. I stood perfectly still, letting her hurl her delusional insults at me. I looked at the dazzling diamonds around her neck and the smug, protective stance Preston had taken right behind her shoulder. I asked her exactly how she defined her success. I kept my voice low and terrifyingly calm, forcing her to lean in to hear me. I reminded her of the sweltering summer 4 years ago when we shared a cramped two-bedroom apartment near the university, long before she met Preston, and long before she became the darling of the Black elite. I reminded her of the countless sleepless nights I spent sitting on our cheap sofa, coding a predictive financial algorithm. It was a complex mathematical model I designed specifically to help underfunded minority businesses secure microloans from risk-averse banks. It was my passion project, my intellectual property, and the foundation of the exact same tech initiative she was currently claiming as her own brilliant invention. Ebony did not even flinch. The accusation of theft did not bring a single drop of shame to her flawless face. She actually scoffed, rolling her eyes as if I had just brought up an irrelevant piece of ancient history. She crossed her arms over her emerald dress and told me that an idea was completely worthless without proper execution. She claimed that Preston was the one who saw the true vision that I clearly lacked. He was the one who provided the initial seed capital, the elite networking connections, and the aggressive business strategy, while I was too scared and small-minded to take a real risk. My own sister looked me dead in the eye and told me she had done me a massive favor by taking my proprietary code because it was destined to sit and rot on an old hard drive anyway. She genuinely believed she was the hero of this story. I felt a cold, dark hollow open up inside my chest, where my love for my sister used to be. I asked her what exactly her role was in this multi-million-dollar empire. If Preston was the one who handled the capital and the strategy. Ebony proudly straightened her posture, throwing her shoulders back so the diamonds caught the light again. She proudly declared that she was the chief executive officer. She said she was the visionary, the face of modern Black excellence that single-handedly secured the federal grant backing. She genuinely believed her mere presence and her marketing savvy were what convinced the United States government to hand over $50 million. She had completely bought into the elaborate illusion of her own absolute brilliance. I took a deliberate step closer to my sister, ignoring the searing white-hot pain radiating through my punctured lung. I decided to ask her a very simple basic technical question. If you are the visionary founder and the chief executive officer, Ebony, what is the administrative passcode to the primary routing server? What is the specific encryption protocol used for the offshore holding accounts where the investor funds are currently being stored? Ebony froze. The arrogant, untouchable mask slipped from her face for a fraction of a second, leaving behind a look of sheer bewildered panic. She looked quickly over her shoulder at Preston, who was suddenly standing rigid, his jaw clenched tight with rising anxiety. Ebony looked back at me and stammered. She stumbled over her words, claiming that as the chief executive, she did not deal with trivial back-end coding or menial accounting tasks. She defensively stated that Preston handled all the technical logistics, the banking transfers, and the corporate legalities, while she focused exclusively on public relations board meetings and brand expansion. I stared at her perfectly manicured, trembling hands and her wide, clueless, defensive eyes. The truth hit me with staggering, absolute clarity. Ebony had absolutely no idea what was actually going on. She did not know that Preston had secretly diluted her ownership to a mere 2%, holding all the actual power in hidden shell companies. She did not know that the $50 million federal grant was going to be wired directly to untraceable accounts in the Cayman Islands by tomorrow morning. And most importantly, she did not know about the dark, silent parking garage, the severed rubber brake line, or the horrifying fact that her husband had actively tried to murder her sister to prevent a routine compliance audit. My golden child sister was nothing but a puppet. She was a greedy, willingly blind puppet who allowed a rich white man to steal her older sister's life's work just so she could wear expensive silk dresses and receive meaningless awards from the Atlanta elite. She had eagerly traded her loyalty and her family for a hollow corporate title and a diamond necklace. She was completely ignorant of the literal blood on her husband's hands, but she was entirely complicit in the massive financial theft that had put the deadly weapon in his grip to begin with. Her willful ignorance did not absolve her of guilt, it only made her pathetic. I looked at my sister, feeling the last remaining shred of familial affection wither and turn to ash inside my chest. I told her to enjoy her fake crown and her stolen spotlight while it lasted. I whispered that the plastic award she was receiving tonight was going to be the most expensive thing she would ever own. Before Ebony could formulate a response to my ominous warning, a loud, booming voice echoed over the ballroom speakers, interrupting our confrontation and drawing the attention of the entire room toward the main stage. The booming voice of my father echoed through the massive ballroom, cutting through the tense silence that had fallen between my sister and me. Wallace stood at the center of the main stage, bathed in the warm glow of the theatrical spotlights. He had completely abandoned the panicked father routine from moments earlier and slipped effortlessly back into his role as the charismatic megachurch pastor. He held a gold-plated microphone in one hand and raised the other toward the crystal chandeliers, demanding the attention of the 500 wealthy guests. The room immediately quieted down out of sheer conditioned respect for the man who held the spiritual and financial keys to the city. I turned my back on Ebony, leaving her fuming in her emerald silk dress and focused entirely on the stage. Wallace began his speech with a smooth, practiced prayer blessing the extravagant Thanksgiving feast that was waiting in the adjoining dining hall. His voice was rich and melodic, carrying the exact cadence that had convinced thousands of working-class parishioners to empty their wallets into his offering plates every Sunday. He spoke about community and resilience and the beautiful power of Black excellence rising to meet the challenges of the modern world. The elite crowd murmured their agreements and nodded along, completely captivated by his performance. Wallace let a dramatic pause stretch across the room before pivoting to the real reason this gala existed. He announced that tonight they were not just giving thanks for their blessings, but they were actively building a future for minority entrepreneurs. He declared with absolute booming pride that their family foundation was officially partnering with the federal government to secure a historic $50 million diversity grant. The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. City officials and wealthy real estate moguls stood up from their tables clapping enthusiastically for a fraud they believed was a victory for their community. Wallace smiled, his perfectly white teeth gleaming under the stage lights. He extended his arm toward the front row, gesturing for the architects of this supposed miracle to join him. He called out my sister's name, praising her as a visionary black female founder, and then he called for Preston, labeling him the ultimate ally and an incredibly generous venture capitalist. I watched Preston place his hand on the small of Ebony's back, guiding her toward the stage stairs with a sickening display of protective affection. They looked like the absolute perfect power couple stepping up to claim their throne. The sheer audacity of their lie pumped a fresh wave of burning adrenaline through my veins, entirely drowning out the agonizing throb of my broken ribs. I did not wait for the applause to die down. I moved away from the edge of the crowd, walking purposefully toward the far side of the stage. The private security guards hired by Preston were entirely distracted by the cheering crowd and the bright flashing lights of the hired photographers taking pictures of the golden couple. The flashbulbs created a strobe effect across the stage, momentarily blinding anyone looking directly at the center podium. I used that visual chaos to my advantage. I bypassed the security perimeter, stepping onto the plush carpeted stairs leading up to the platform. Every step required a massive amount of physical effort. The fractured bones in my chest shifted slightly, grinding against each other with a sickening internal friction. My breath hitched in my throat, but my red-crimson suit hid the rigid mechanical way I was forcing my body to move. I kept my eyes locked on the empty podium. I reached the top of the platform just as Preston and Ebony took their places beside my father. Wallace was handing Ebony a thick leather-bound folder containing the fraudulent grant contracts for a ceremonial photo opportunity. He did not see me approaching from his blind spot. Resting on a small wooden podium near the edge of the stage was the spare microphone meant for the guest speakers. I walked straight up to the podium and wrapped my fingers around the cold metal handle. The sudden movement finally caught my father's eye. Wallace turned his head, and his charismatic pastoral smile instantly dissolved into a look of absolute sheer terror. The heavy leather folder slipped in his hands as he realized I had breached the stage. Wallace was a master manipulator, and his survival instincts kicked in immediately. He lunged forward, cutting off my path to the center of the stage. He threw his arm around my shoulders, squeezing his fingers brutally hard against my bruised collarbone. He pulled his own microphone to his mouth and forced out a loud, booming laugh that sounded entirely hollow. The sound vibrated through the floorboards beneath my feet. He told the confused audience that his troubled daughter had decided to make a surprise appearance. He spun a rapid, sickeningly smooth lie, claiming that I was currently battling some severe mental health struggles following a tragic accident, but that the family loved me unconditionally. He proclaimed that they welcomed my impromptu desire to share this wholly momentous occasion with them, because true Black families never abandon their own. The crowd offered a few polite, nervous chuckles, completely unsure of how to react to this bizarre family dynamic playing out under the bright lights. I did not try to physically fight my father. I knew my battered body could not break his grip. Instead, I simply raised the spare microphone to my lips. I ignored the agonizing pressure of his fingers digging into my shoulder and looked directly out at the sea of wealthy faces staring up at me. The ballroom was dead silent, waiting for the crazy daughter to speak. My voice echoed through the massive speakers, ringing out crystal clear and completely devoid of any hysteria or madness. I told the crowd that I had just survived a near-fatal car crash where my ribs were shattered and my organs were bleeding. I heard a collective gasp ripple through the front rows as the guests finally registered the dark purple bruises covering my jaw and the unnatural stiffness of my posture. I told them I was in absolute agony, but I could not possibly miss the chance to stand on this stage and celebrate the biggest lie ever sold to the city of Atlanta. Wallace instantly tried to snatch the microphone from my hand, but I stepped backward, twisting my body away from him. The sudden movement sent a blinding flash of pain through my chest, but I kept the microphone firmly pressed near my mouth. I told the audience that the $50 million diversity grant they were clapping for was nothing but a massive criminal money laundering scheme. I announced that the beautiful Black female founder standing on the stage owned less than 2% of her own company. and that the generous white investor beside her had spent the entire evening mocking their community behind their backs. The silence in the room was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. The entire hierarchy of the Atlanta elite was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the accusation dropping from the speakers. Preston realized instantly that I was not just throwing a verbal tantrum. His pale eyes darted wildly across the room, assessing the threat. He knew that my words alone could not convict him, but they were enough to make the federal government freeze the grant money pending an investigation. He dropped his fake supportive husband act completely. He raised his hand and made a sharp, urgent gesture toward the back of the ballroom. His private security team, massive men wearing dark suits and earpieces, immediately began shoving their way through the shocked guests, rushing toward the stage to physically silence me. They were moving fast, overturning chairs and pushing wealthy donors out of their way. I did not panic as the security guards rushed the platform. I knew I only had a few seconds before they reached the stairs and dragged me away. I reached into the inner pocket of my crimson blazer and pulled out the heavy encrypted metal flash drive. I did not look at Preston or my horrified parents. I turned my gaze directly toward the elevated sound booth located just off the right side of the stage. Sitting behind the massive audio mixing board was a young AV technician wearing a black baseball cap. He was the insider that Vaughn had paid off earlier that evening. I walked quickly to the edge of the stage, ignoring the heavy footsteps of the security guards charging up the stairs behind me. I extended my arm, holding the silver flash drive out over the drop-off. The young technician leaned over the railing of his booth and snatched the drive directly from my fingers. Preston screamed at his guards to stop the technician, but it was already too late. The trap had been successfully armed, and the countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun. The AV technician did not hesitate. The second the metal flash drive left my fingers and landed in his palm, he pivoted back to his massive sound and video console and jammed it directly into the primary input port. Preston was screaming at his private security guards to cut the power to the entire ballroom, but the heavy acoustic padding of the walls swallowed his panic. The jazz band had already completely stopped playing, sensing the violent shift in the atmosphere. The 500 elite guests were dead silent, watching the stage with bated breath. High above the wooden podium, the three massive lead presentation screens that were originally supposed to display a glowing celebratory montage of Ebony's fake achievements suddenly flashed to life. The bright, harsh white glare illuminated the entire front of the ballroom, casting long, sharp shadows across my parents' horrified faces. It was not the hidden dashboard camera footage of my near-fatal accident. Not yet. I wanted to dismantle their financial empire piece by piece before I buried them with the ultimate violent crime. The screens displayed a complex, sprawling spreadsheet that I had painstakingly assembled from the encrypted city portal. It was the official capitalization table and the binding legal articles of incorporation for Ebony's heavily praised tech initiative. The original documents had been buried behind layers of corporate firewalls, but my predictive algorithm had sliced through Preston's digital security 3 days ago. I leaned closer to the microphone, letting my voice project cold and clear across the sea of tailored tuxedos and expensive silk gowns. I told the audience to stop looking at me and to look closely at the screens above my head. I told them they were currently looking at the actual legal ownership structure of the company they were about to hand $50 million of federal taxpayer money to. I watched the city councilmen, the mayor, and the federal grant administrators in the front row, squinting at the projected numbers. Their polite initial confusion began to rapidly morph into absolute, genuine outrage as the mathematical realization of what they were seeing finally settled in. I did not let the silence stretch for too long. I broke the data down for them with the surgical, relentless precision of a senior compliance officer. I pointed out the specific column on the left screen highlighting the equity distribution. I announced that my sister, the supposed brilliant visionary, the highly celebrated black female founder, and the public majority shareholder of this minority enterprise legally owned exactly 2% of the total company stock. A collective sharp gasp rippled through the massive ballroom. Ebony flinched violently, stepping backward from the podium as if the microphone had physically struck her in the chest. Her eyes darted frantically up to the glowing screens, reading the dense legal documents bearing her own forged digital signatures. The heavy diamond necklace around her throat seemed to suddenly weigh her down. I kept speaking, driving the proverbial blade deeper into Preston's chest with every word. I explained exactly how the fraud was structured. I told the crowd that Preston had systematically diluted Ebony's shares over the last 3 years, using a labyrinth of hidden corporate bylaws and staggered dummy stock issuances. He had intentionally weaponized her identity against the very people the grant was meant to help. He used her black face, her gender, and her pristine social standing to comfortably meet the strict demographic requirements necessary to qualify for federal minority development funds. She was nothing more than the perfect shield. She was the flawless, untouchable token puppet that allowed him to bypass rigorous government scrutiny and secure millions in diverse capital while doing absolutely none of the actual technological work. The anger in the room was becoming a physical, palpable force. The wealthy investors and prominent political figures who had been so eager to associate their names with a progressive local tech initiative suddenly realized they were sitting in the exact center of a massive, highly public federal crime. Wooden chairs scraped loudly against the marble floor as several prominent donors abruptly stood up, their faces red with indignation and betrayal. Preston stood entirely frozen on the edge of the stage, his pale skin shining with a thick layer of nervous sweat. His custom midnight blue suit suddenly looked cheap and poorly fitted. The arrogant, untouchable smugness had been entirely wiped away, leaving behind the terrified, wide-eyed expression of a trapped rat. He opened his mouth to shout a denial, to aggressively claim the documents were fabricated by a jealous sibling, but I cut him off before he could form a single coherent syllable. I tapped the console remote and advanced to the next slide on the massive LED screens. This new document was a highly detailed wire transfer schematic mapping out international banking routes. I told the captive audience that the remaining 98% of the equity was not held by a diverse board of directors or an inclusive advisory committee as promised in the grant application. It was entirely controlled by 3 offshore shell companies registered under anonymous proxies in the Cayman Islands and Belize. I read the names of the holding groups out loud, letting the blatant illegality ring clearly through the heavy ballroom speakers. I explained that every single cent of the $50 million grant they were celebrating tonight was permanently scheduled to be funneled directly into those untraceable overseas accounts by early Monday morning. Preston was not building a tech initiative to uplift the Atlanta community. He was executing a massive parasitic extraction of federal wealth, and he was quietly using my parents' untaxed church foundation accounts to launder the initial seed money to hide his digital tracks. My father Wallace gripped the wooden edge of the stage, his knuckles turning entirely white. The smooth, pastoral charisma he relied on to continually manipulate his massive congregation was utterly useless here under the harsh glare of financial reality. He could not preach his way out of federal wire fraud and tax evasion. My mother, Vivian, had collapsed heavily into a nearby velvet chair, pressing her manicured hands tightly over her face as she finally realized that her precious elite social standing was completely and permanently eradicated. The wealthy society friends she had spent decades frantically courting were currently glaring at her with absolute unfiltered disgust. She had literally thrown her own injured daughter away to blindly protect a son-in-law who was actively robbing their entire community blind. I looked directly at Preston, ignoring the burning pain radiating from my fractured ribs. He was still technically surrounded by his private security guards, but the massive men in dark suits had completely stopped moving forward. They were hired hourly muscle, not dedicated accomplices to corporate treason. They looked up at the undeniable proof on the screens and slowly stepped away from him, recognizing a rapidly sinking ship when they saw one. I spoke softly into the microphone, but the massive amplification made it sound like a final, undeniable judgment. I told Preston that the routine compliance audit he had tried to stop was officially complete and his fraudulent company had failed. The low hum of angry murmurs in the ballroom began to rapidly escalate into a loud, chaotic uproar. Federal administrators in the front rows were aggressively tapping on their phones, undoubtedly calling their respective legal departments to freeze all associated assets and launch immediate investigations. The jazz musicians in the corner were hastily packing their expensive instruments, eager to escape the impending arrival of federal law enforcement. The flawless gilded illusion of the Sterling family legacy was shattering into a million irreparable pieces right in front of my eyes, and I was holding the hammer. Ebony had been standing perfectly still for the last 3 minutes, her emerald green silks shimmering under the harsh white light of the projected spreadsheets. The golden child who had spent her entire pampered life basking in unearned glory was finally forced to look directly at the ugly, hollow truth of her own manufactured existence. She was not a tech genius. She was not a visionary founder. She was a greedy, gullible pawn who had sold her soul for a meaningless plastic award. She slowly turned her head away from the projected financial documents and looked directly at the pale, sweating man she had married. Her chest heaved as she struggled to pull oxygen into her constrained lungs. Preston desperately tried to reach out to her, his hands trembling wildly as he muttered frantic, pathetic reassurances that it was all a massive misunderstanding. Ebony slapped his hands away with a violent, sharp motion that echoed over the crowd. She completely ignored the angry investors, the flashing cameras, and our horrified, ruined parents. She stepped directly into Preston's personal space, her voice cutting through the rising noise of the chaotic ballroom, demanding to know if a single word of the presentation was true. The heavy silence in the ballroom was shattered by Ebony's voice. She demanded to know if the projected financial documents were real. She stepped closer to Preston, her emerald dress swishing against the floor, and asked him how he could possibly dilute her ownership to 2%. Preston looked at his wife and then looked out at the sea of disgusted wealthy investors. He saw the federal grant administrators furiously typing on their phones and the city council members shaking their heads in absolute revulsion. He realized in that exact moment that his pristine reputation was entirely destroyed. There was no smooth lie that could untangle him from the federal wire fraud displayed on the glowing screens above us. The realization caused the final remaining fragments of his charming, benevolent facade to crack and fall away. He did not apologize to his wife. He did not beg for her forgiveness or attempt to comfort her. Instead, the corner of his pale mouth curled into a sneer of absolute pure disgust. He looked down at Ebony as if she were a piece of dirt on his expensive shoes. His voice echoed through the room, stripped of all its fake southern warmth and replaced by a cold, aggressive venom. He told her she was a delusional, incompetent token who was completely incapable of running a real business. He stated that her only actual value was her face and her gender, which allowed him to check the diversity boxes required by the federal government. The cruelty in his words was entirely unfiltered. He mocked her for believing she was a visionary when she could not even read a basic profit and loss statement. Ebony flinched as if he had physically struck her, but Preston was not finished. He turned his aggressive glare toward my parents, who were standing paralyzed on the edge of the stage. He raised his voice so the entire ballroom could hear every single humiliating word. He shouted that without his networking, his capital, and his inherent white privilege, the Sterling family would be absolutely nothing. He told my father that without his offshore financial structuring, Wallace would still be sweating in a run-down canvas tent in rural Georgia, begging working-class people for their loose change. He claimed that he was the only reason they were allowed to dine at country clubs and attend elite political galas. He branded the entire family as a group of pathetic social climbers who were entirely dependent on his goodwill to survive. The sheer racial hostility and arrogant entitlement of his rant caused a collective gasp to ripple through the 500 guests. Wealthy donors, who had previously praised Preston as an ally, now looked at him with sheer revulsion. Ebony stood frozen in the center of the stage, tears completely ruining her immaculate makeup. The golden child had finally been stripped of her unearned crown and forced to see the ugly reality of her marriage. She turned her tear-stained face toward our parents, looking for a lifeline. She expected Wallace and Vivian to rush to her defense, to banish the man who had just humiliated their favorite daughter in front of the entire city. What happened next was the ultimate devastating betrayal. Wallace and Vivian did rush forward, but they did not go to comfort Ebony. They pushed completely past their weeping daughter, ignoring her extended hands, and placed themselves protectively around Preston. Vivian reached out and grabbed Preston's arm, her face twisted in a mask of sheer panic. She turned toward the disgusted crowd and began begging them not to leave. She pleaded with the mayor and the city officials, telling them that Preston was simply under a lot of stress, and that this was just a minor domestic misunderstanding blown completely out of proportion by an unstable older sister. She completely validated the man who had just degraded her entire family solely to protect her proximity to his wealth. Wallace grabbed his own gold-plated microphone, his hands shaking violently. The smooth, charismatic pastor was sweating profusely under the stage lights. He begged the federal administrators to ignore the financial documents on the screens. He pleaded with them not to freeze the $50 million diversity grant. His booming voice cracked as the desperation fully took over. He admitted right there in front of his elite congregation and the city's political leaders that his family foundation was completely insolvent. He confessed that the megachurch was facing imminent catastrophic bankruptcy and that they desperately needed the incoming grant money to keep their doors open. He threw away his entire moral authority and his daughter's dignity to protect a fraudulent white savior because his own financial empire was secretly turning to dust. I stood at the podium, watching my parents eagerly debase themselves for a man who despised them. I felt the heavy crystal glass of the microphone resting in my bruised hands. The physical pain radiating from my shattered ribs was entirely muted by the cold, calculated clarity flooding my mind. I raised the microphone close to my red lips. A low, dark sound escaped my throat. I laughed. It was not a hysterical sound, but a hollow, chilling laugh that echoed heavily through the massive ballroom speakers. The sound instantly silenced my father's pathetic pleading and stopped Vivian from her frantic begging. The entire room froze, turning their attention back to the battered woman in the crimson suit who had orchestrated this entire destruction. I looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. I told him that he was begging the wrong man for salvation. I let my voice project loud and steady over the hushed crowd, making sure every single person in the room heard my next words. I told Wallace that I knew exactly why his precious church was completely bankrupt. I whispered into the microphone that the church did not run out of money because of poor attendance or a declining economy. I announced that I knew exactly where the congregation's money had disappeared to and the specific dark illegal reasons he and Preston had been moving millions of untaxed dollars through offshore shell companies for the past 5 years. I did not wait for my father to formulate another pathetic excuse. I turned my head slightly toward the elevated sound booth and gave the young technician in the baseball cap another sharp nod. He did not hesitate for a second. His fingers flew across the audio mixing board, and the 3 massive LED screens above the stage flickered wildly before settling on a completely new set of documents. The sleek corporate spreadsheets belonging to Preston's fraudulent tech initiative vanished instantly. In their place were the deeply guarded private financial records of the Sterling Family Foundation and the internal banking ledgers for my father's megachurch. The collective gasp from the audience was entirely different this time. It was not just the wealthy secular investors reacting to corporate theft. Interspersed throughout the massive ballroom were the senior deacons, the choir directors, and the most prominent financial contributors to my father's congregation. They were looking up at the 50-foot projection of their own Holy Church logo, stamped at the top of deeply incriminating bank statements. I lifted the microphone again, feeling the cold crystal press against my bruised palm. I told the hushed crowd that my day job as a senior compliance officer required me to trace hidden assets through complex financial labyrinths. I explained that finding Preston's offshore accounts was actually the easy part. The real challenge was discovering where he got the millions of dollars in untraceable seed money to launch his initial diversity fraud before the federal grant was ever approved. I tapped the console remote and a red laser pointer icon appeared on the center screen. I guided the bright red dot toward a column of weekly bank deposits to look closely at the massive influx of cash generated by the Sunday tithes and the special offering plates. I explained how working-class families, single mothers, and elderly parishioners had emptied their modest savings to support my father's promised community youth center, and his affordable housing outreach programs. The laser pointer dragged slowly across the screen, highlighting the outgoing transfer columns. I told them the youth center was never built because the holy foundation of this church was entirely hollow. The screens shifted to display a secondary set of hidden routing numbers. I walked the horrified congregation through the exact money laundering process my parents had perfected over the last 5 years. I showed them how the weekly donations were aggressively funneled out of the church building fund and straight into a series of private blind trusts controlled exclusively by Vivian and Wallace. I read the itemized luxury purchases directly off the projected statements. I listed the sudden cash infusions used to maintain their elite country club memberships when the church itself was actively defaulting on its primary mortgage. I pointed out the seasonal first-class trips to Milan, the custom-tailored pastoral suits, and the $250,000 spent renovating the swimming pool at their private estate. They were actively draining the lifeblood of their own vulnerable community to fund a lavish, untouchable lifestyle. But the theft did not stop at luxury clothing and exotic vacations. I advanced to the final devastating slide. It displayed a web of continuous wire transfers between my parents' hidden trusts and a supposedly anonymous legal firm in downtown Atlanta. I broke down the dates and the receiver accounts connecting the dark dots for the captive audience. I explained that my wholly untouchable parents were using stolen church donations to pay off Preston's mounting hush money debts. Preston had been aggressively bribing early investors, disgruntled former employees, and corrupt city inspectors who had caught wind of his initial corporate fraud long before this gala. My father was essentially acting as the primary silent financier for his son-in-law's criminal enterprise, using the blind faith and hard-earned money of his own congregation to keep the entire fraudulent empire from collapsing. The reaction from the church members in the audience was instantaneous and visceral. Men and women who had trusted my father with their spiritual and financial lives began shouting in raw, unfiltered betrayal. The polite elite gala had completely devolved into an active, volatile crime scene. The reality of her impending absolute ruin finally shattered my mother's silent, panicked facade. The threat of losing her precious social standing, her designer wardrobe, and her unearned elite status broke something fundamental inside her brain. Vivian lunged forward, her manicured hands trembling with absolute unhinged rage. Her expensive silk gown twisted around her legs as she scrambled frantically toward the podium. She did not care about the flashing cameras or the federal administrators watching her public meltdown. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my bruised face and began to scream. Her voice was shrill and desperate, completely devoid of her usual refined Southern elegance. She shrieked that I was a jealous, hateful demon sent straight from hell to tear down our family legacy. She frantically tried to rally the disgusted crowd, shouting over the noise that I was nothing but a bitter, unstable woman, trying to destroy the beautiful image of Black excellence they had worked so hard to build. She demanded that they ignore the screens, claiming I had fabricated everything out of pure spite because I could never be as successful or beloved as my younger sister. The cold, hollow space inside my chest froze over entirely. I did not yell back at her. I did not need to raise my voice to destroy her. I simply leaned closer to the microphone and let my words slice through her hysterical screaming with absolute chilling clarity. I looked at my mother and told her, "There is no excellence here." I let the silence stretch for a fraction of a second before delivering the final undeniable truth. I told her there are just parasites in designer suits. My words echoed heavily through the massive ballroom speakers, finalizing the absolute destruction of her identity. Vivian physically recoiled, as if she had been struck collapsing against my father's side. Wallace realized in that exact moment that his charismatic pastoral charm was completely dead. He could not preach or smile his way out of this definitive public execution. The financial proof was glowing above his head, and his devoted congregation was rapidly turning into an angry mob. His survival instincts bypassed any remaining shred of logic or grace. He resorted to pure, desperate brute force. His panicked eyes scanned the chaotic ballroom and locked onto a group of large, muscular men sitting near the front tables. They were his loyal church deacons, the men who typically acted as his personal security detail during chaotic Sunday services. Wallace pointed a trembling hand directly at me and screamed into his own microphone. He commanded the deacons to rush the stage and physically drag me out of the building. The heavy wooden chairs crashed against the marble floor as several massive men stood up and began moving aggressively toward the platform stairs, while I stood perfectly still waiting for the impact. The heavy footfalls of the massive church deacons vibrated through the wooden stage platform. These were men I had known since I was a little girl. Men who usually handed out Sunday programs and collected offering plates, now charging up the stairs to physically drag me out of the building. Wallace had given the order, and they were blindly following their spiritual leader. I did not retreat a single inch. I braced my heavy boots against the floorboards, feeling the agonizing grind of my fractured ribs, protesting the stance. I reached my bruised hand deep into my black velvet clutch purse, bypassing the spare burner phone and wrapping my fingers around a thick, greasy piece of severed black rubber. I pulled the severed brake line out of the silk lining and slammed it down onto the polished wooden podium. The heavy metal fitting struck the wood with a loud, aggressive thud that echoed through the microphone and froze the advancing deacons in their tracks. I raised my hand and gave the young audio technician one final sharp nod. The massive lead screens behind me instantly shifted away from the damning church bank statements. The bright white spreadsheets were completely swallowed by the grainy green and black footage of a high-definition security camera. The ballroom fell into an absolute deathly silence. The 500 wealthy guests stopped murmuring and stared up at the 40-foot-tall projection glowing above the stage. The footage showed the dark concrete underground parking garage of my apartment building. A bright digital timestamp in the bottom corner proved to the entire room that this was recorded exactly 3 hours before my horrific near-fatal crash. A figure wearing a dark hooded jacket crept silently into the frame carrying a heavy metal tool. The audience watched in paralyzed horror as the figure slid under the front chassis of my dark sedan. The camera angle was absolutely perfect. The man shifted his weight and looked over his shoulder directly into the hidden lens. The green night vision illuminated Preston's terrified pale face, clearly for the entire world to see. The high-quality audio system captured the unmistakable violent metallic snap of heavy steel clippers severing a primary brake line. A collective massive gasp of pure terror ripped through the elite crowd. This was no longer a white-collar corporate scandal involving tax evasion and forged documents. They were sitting in a luxury ballroom watching a premeditated violent murder attempt play out in high definition. The wealthy political donors and federal grant administrators scrambled backward, pushing their velvet chairs away from the stage, as if Preston was suddenly a highly radioactive threat. The church deacons, who were mere inches away from grabbing my arms, slowly backed away, their eyes wide with absolute unfiltered disgust. They looked at my father, their supposed holy pastor, and then looked back up at the massive screen where his golden son-in-law was actively sabotaging my vehicle to cause a fatal crash. Preston stumbled backward on the stage, his legs giving out completely beneath him. He hit the polished floor hard, his expensive midnight blue suit bunching up around his shoulders, as he frantically tried to scramble away from the glaring, undeniable light of his own violent crime. I did not care about Preston scrambling on the floor. I slowly turned my head, ignoring the blinding physical pain shooting through my chest, and looked directly at my parents. Wallace was hyperventilating, clutching the lapels of his custom suit as he stared up at the security footage, completely out of his mind with fear. Vivian looked like she was experiencing a sudden and total psychological break. The perfect, elegant pastor's wife was trembling violently, her pristine emerald silk dress ruined by the cold sweat pouring off her skin. Her social standing was dead. Her financial empire was dead. And now she was standing on a stage next to a documented attempted murderer. I stared deeply into her panicked eyes, holding the greasy, severed brake line up for her to specifically see. The sheer, overwhelming terror of being legally associated with a homicide broke whatever was left of her rational, calculating mind. Vivian could not handle the disgust radiating from the city officials and the wealthy donors she had spent decades frantically courting. In a desperate, unhinged attempt to distance herself from the murder plot, she completely abandoned all logic and self-preservation. Vivian lunged towards the center of the stage, waving her manicured hands wildly at the horrified crowd below. She leaned directly toward the spare microphone, picking up my audio feed. She screamed at the top of her lungs that she and Wallace only told him to disable my car, so I could not make it to the senior compliance audit meeting. Her shrill, panicked voice echoed through the massive speakers bouncing off the crystal chandeliers as she shrieked that they did not tell him to kill me. The entire massive ballroom went completely dead silent. Not a single crystal wine glass clinked. Not a single breath was heard from the 500 guests. The jazz musicians in the far corner froze completely in the shadows. The federal agents disguised as waiters stopped moving toward the stage. The absolute silence was deafening and heavier than anything I had ever experienced. I stood perfectly still behind the wooden podium, the severed rubber hose feeling like a block of solid ice in my bruised hands. The cold, hollow space inside my chest rapidly expanded, swallowing up all the remaining adrenaline and leaving behind an absolute freezing void. I looked at the trembling woman who had given birth to me, and the reality finally crashed down heavily on my fractured body. My own parents did not just cover up Preston's crimes after the fact. They had actively conspired with him to physically harm me. They had ordered the sabotage of my vehicle, knowing the severe danger it posed, simply to stop a financial audit and protect their stolen fraudulent wealth. The dead silence that had choked the ballroom immediately following. Vivian's shrill, panicked confession shattered into a million chaotic pieces. 500 of Atlanta's wealthiest elites, prominent political figures, and massive mega-church donors simultaneously realized they were standing in the exact center of a massive federal fraud scene and an active attempted murder investigation. The polite murmurs of confusion instantly mutated into a deafening roar of absolute terror. Panic ripped through the massive room like a violent shockwave. Women wearing heavy custom couture gowns aggressively shoved past each other in a frantic, desperate stampede toward the Grand Oak exit doors. They abandoned their expensive designer clutches and kicked off their diamond-encrusted heels, tripping over overturned velvet chairs just to move faster. City council members and federal grant administrators, who had been eagerly smiling for photo opportunities an hour ago, were now ruthlessly elbowing wealthy, elderly donors out of their way, absolutely terrified of being legally associated with the impending wave of federal indictments. Crystal wine glasses shattered sharply against the polished marble floor as the lavishly decorated front tables were violently flipped over in the mad dash for salvation. Preston scrambled up from the wooden stage floor, his expensive midnight blue suit torn at the knee and severely stained with cold sweat. The horrifying reality of an imminent lengthy prison sentence for violent attempted homicide completely short-circuited whatever remained of his polished rationality. He darted his frantic wide eyes around the rapidly emptying ballroom, watching his entire fraudulent financial empire burn to ashes under the glaring white lights of the projection screens. The charming, benevolent venture capitalist persona was completely dead. He needed immediate leverage. He needed a human shield to navigate the volatile, panicked crowd and escape the premises before the local authorities inevitably breached the building. He lunged aggressively across the stage and clamped his large, trembling hand around Ebony's slender bicep. His grip was viciously tight, burying his long fingers deep into her soft skin, causing her shimmering emerald silk dress to bunch up around his white knuckles. He yanked her forcefully toward the backstage stairs, snarling venomously under his breath that she was coming with him right now whether she wanted to or not. Ebony stumbled forward, her tall stiletto heels catching awkwardly on the polished wooden floorboards, but the crushing, suffocating weight of the night's endless revelations had finally broken her lifelong habit of blind compliance. The beautifully pampered golden child, who had spent decades smiling prettily and eagerly obeying every single directive given to her by manipulative men, finally found her spine. She dug her heels firmly into the stage-halting Preston's desperate forward momentum. She twisted her body violently, wrenching her arm, but forcing him to look directly back at her. The sheer, absolute, unfiltered disgust radiating from her tear-streaked face made him hesitate for a fraction of a second. Ebony did not scream. She did not cry or try to negotiate. She simply pulled back and swung her free hand with every ounce of physical strength she possessed. The sharp, deafening crack of her palm striking his cheek echoed sharply over the chaotic roar of the stampeding ballroom. Preston staggered backward heavily, his face snapping violently to the side from the sheer, unexpected force of the blow. A bright, angry red handprint instantly bloomed across his pale, sweating skin. The final remaining shred of his civilized disguise melted away completely, leaving only a cornered, violent, and desperate animal. He let out a guttural, snarling sound of pure, unhinged rage and lunged forward, shoving both of his heavy hands hard against her chest. The brutal, unexpected impact sent Ebony flying backward through the air. She crashed heavily onto the hard stage floor, her limbs tangling awkwardly in the heavy silk fabric of her expensive gown. A sharp, sudden cry of pain escaped her lips as her shoulder blades slammed ruthlessly against the wooden boards. I watched the violent physical assault unfold from my secure spot behind the podium, the severed, greasy brake line still cold and heavy in my bruised hand. I turned my gaze slightly toward my parents, fully expecting them to finally drop their selfish financial obsessions and instinctively rush to the aid of their precious, injured golden child. Instead, I witnessed the ultimate devastating display of their hollow, parasitic nature. Wallace and Vivian had completely ignored their youngest daughter hitting the floor. They were actively on their hands and knees near the edge of the stage, frantically stuffing discarded financial ledgers and highly incriminating church bank statements into Vivian's ruined designer purse. They were aggressively fighting each other over crumpled pieces of paper, desperately trying to hide the physical proof of their holy embezzlement, while the golden daughter they had worshipped and elevated her entire life lay bruised and weeping just a few feet away. The pristine Sterling family legacy was violently cannibalizing itself in real time, and I simply stood perfectly still, taking shallow breaths and watching them tear each other apart. The agonizing, relentless throb in my shattered ribs was momentarily eclipsed by the cold, dark, absolute satisfaction flooding my veins. They had all been perfectly willing to casually sacrifice my life and my sanity to protect their fraudulent wealth and their elite, untouchable social standing. Now the very greed that had bound them together was ripping them to shreds. Vivian was practically crawling on the dirty floor, her manicured hands shaking violently as she tried to salvage whatever tiny scraps of her ruined reputation she could find. Wallace was aggressively pushing his own wife aside, grabbing at offshore account documents, while completely ignoring the terrified, frantic screams of his loyal congregation fleeing the room. They were just desperate, pathetic rats scrambling frantically over each other on a rapidly sinking ship. I looked down at Ebony, who was slowly trying to push herself up from the floorboards. Her emerald dress was torn at the shoulder, and her perfectly styled hair was a ruined, tangled mess. She looked toward our parents, her eyes wide and pleading silently, begging for them to help her up. But Wallace and Vivian did not even glance in her direction. They were entirely consumed by their own impending legal destruction. The realization hit Ebony like a secondary physical blow. She finally understood the cold, hard truth that I had known since I was a child. Their love was entirely conditional-based, exclusively on what you could do to elevate their public image. The exact moment she became a liability, they abandoned her without a single second thought. She sat heavily on the stage floor, pulling her knees to her chest, completely shattered and utterly alone. Preston realized that his human shield was completely useless and that the elite guests were rapidly escaping with the full, undeniable knowledge of his violent crimes. The massive LED screens above us were still broadcasting the grainy security footage of him sabotaging my car on a continuous damning loop. He turned his frantic, wild gaze back toward the stage, his eyes locking onto the small silver flash drive still plugged into the audio-visual console. He knew that small metal drive contained the original, unencrypted files, the raw financial data, and the security videos that the federal investigators would definitely use to put him away for decades. His blind panic rapidly solidified into a cold, ruthless determination. He wiped a thick line of sweat from his forehead and turned sharply toward the massive private security guards who were hovering near the stage exits, unsure of what to do in the chaos. Preston barked a sharp, desperate, authoritative command over the roar of the fleeing crowd. He explicitly ordered his heavily armed men to immediately lock the grand ballroom doors and secure all the remaining exits. The heavy oak doors slammed shut with a definitive, terrifying, booming thud, instantly trapping the remaining panicked investors, the terrified politicians, and me inside the room. Preston glared up at the stage, his chest heaving aggressively as he announced that nobody leaves until he gets that flash drive. The heavy oak doors that Preston had just ordered sealed shut, suddenly splintered with a deafening, violent crack. The reinforced wood groaned and gave way completely as a synchronized tactical team breached the grand ballroom. The private armed security guards who had been standing defensively at the exits instantly dropped their weapons, kicking them across the polished marble floor and raising their trembling hands in immediate, unconditional surrender. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and IRS printed across their backs flooded into the lavish space. The elite investors, corrupt politicians, and megachurch donors who were trapped inside began screaming and dropping to the floor, covering their heads in absolute terror as the armed agents rapidly secured the massive perimeter. Teams of agents moved swiftly through the tables, zip-tying the wrists of the aggressive church deacons who had tried to attack me moments earlier, while others locked down every single exit point to ensure no one escaped the building. Through the shattered wooden doorway stepped a man whose very presence commanded the chaotic room into an instant fearful silence. He wore his signature tailored black leather jacket over a crisp dark shirt, his posture radiating an absolute undeniable authority. His dark eyes swept over the cowering billionaires and the overturned velvet tables, but he did not stop walking. This was Vaughn. He strode down the center aisle with a slow, measured predator's pace, his heavy boots clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. The federal agents parted for him, respectfully acknowledging his role in this massive sting operation. He did not look at the weeping guests, and he barely glanced at me standing bruised behind the wooden podium. His deadly focus was locked entirely on the pale, sweating man standing on the elevated stage. Preston stumbled backward against the audio-visual console, his face draining of whatever arrogant color it had left. He looked like he desperately wanted the stage floorboards to open up and swallow him whole. Vaughn climbed the stage stairs without breaking his stride, stopping mere inches from Preston's terrified face. The physical contrast between them was stark. Preston was a ruined mess of torn designer fabric and panicked sweat, while Vaughn stood perfectly composed, an immovable force of cold, calculated vengeance. "You really thought you could hide behind a corrupt pastor's collar forever?" Preston Vaughn asked, his voice dangerously low, but carrying perfectly through the hushed, paralyzed ballroom. Preston opened his mouth to speak, his lips trembling violently, but no words came out. Vaughn leaned in closer, his tone dripping with a lethal, quiet intensity. "5 years ago, you orchestrated a hostile takeover of my software firm. You forged my signature on the primary transfer deeds, locked me out of my own secure servers, and stole the proprietary algorithms I built from scratch." Vaughn turned his head slightly, glaring down at Wallace and Vivian, who were still cowering on the floor, clutching their ruined designer clothes. "But you needed clean capital to make the corporate theft look legitimate to the federal regulators. You needed millions in untraceable cash to pay off the board members and silence the auditors. So you crawled to Wallace Sterling and used his wholly tax-exempt megachurch as your personal money laundering front." Wallace let out a pathetic whimpering sound, burying his face in his hands, confirming the dark truth for the federal agents actively taking notes. Vaughn turned back to Preston, his eyes burning with years of suppressed righteous rage. "You took my life's work, and you washed the stolen equity through the Sunday offering plates. You created fake charity drives and ghost vendors to funnel the congregation's donations directly into your offshore accounts. You bled my company dry to build this fake benevolent venture capital persona, and you used this pathetic greedy pastor to hide the massive paper trail." Vaughn gestured toward the glowing LED screens above us, which were still displaying the damning offshore bank routing numbers. I spent 5 relentless years tracking every single dime you stole, waiting in the shadows for the exact moment you felt completely untouchable. I didn't just come here tonight to save Sydney. I came to dismantle your entire fraudulent existence, brick by stolen brick, and take back every single thing that belongs to me. Ebony watched this exchange from the floor, her tear-stained face frozen in absolute horror as she realized the true depth of her husband's criminal origins. The sheer overwhelming weight of the federal presence and Vaughn's undeniable factual truth should have crushed Preston completely. He was surrounded by the FBI, his financial crimes were glowing on massive screens, and the man he had ruined had returned from the ashes to deliver his final judgment. Instead, something deeply twisted and dark snapped inside Preston's brain. The cornered, desperate animal realized it was trapped and chose to bare its fangs in a terrifying display of pure delusional arrogance. Preston threw his head back and let out a sharp, grating laugh that echoed heavily through the tense ballroom. It was not the laugh of a defeated man, but the unhinged cackle of a sociopath who firmly believed he was still playing a game he could ultimately win. He aggressively straightened the lapels of his ruined midnight blue suit and looked at Vaughn with a smirk of absolute pure superiority. "You are 5 years too late, Vaughn," he sneered, his fake southern charm completely replaced by a cold, condescending venom. "Do you honestly believe I would operate at this massive federal level without an ironclad contingency plan already in place?" Preston confidently adjusted his silver cufflinks, deliberately ignoring the FBI agents moving steadily toward the stage stairs with their handcuffs ready. He raised his voice, projecting his words over the room, announcing to the entire crowd and the approaching authorities that he had officially secured diplomatic immunity 3 weeks ago. He smugly revealed that he had purchased a private ambassadorship with a sovereign island nation that was heavily invested in his offshore tech fund, officially granting him complete, absolute protection from domestic prosecution and immediate arrest. He laughed again, louder and more abrasive this time, telling Vaughn that his elite team of international defense lawyers would tie the United States Justice Department in jurisdictional knots for a decade. He claimed his legal team would tear the FBI warrants apart before they even reached a temporary holding cell. Then Preston turned his manic, aggressive gaze toward me, pointing a shaking finger directly at the silver flash drive, still plugged into the stage console. "And as for her little dramatic presentation," Preston mocked, his eyes flashing with pure, unfiltered malice. "Every single corporate spreadsheet, every security video of the parking garage, and every private bank record she displayed on those screens tonight was illegally obtained through corporate espionage, unauthorized wiretaps, and digital theft. It is all fruit of the poisonous tree and entirely inadmissible in any United States court of law. You have absolutely nothing but a stolen flash drive and a bitter, unstable woman's word." Preston's arrogant laughter bounced off the shattered wooden doors, but it did not have the psychological effect he intended. The grating sound was hollow and desperate, lacking the refined, polished confidence he usually wielded like a weapon against those he deemed beneath him. I did not cower at his legal threats, and Vaughn did not flinch at his unhinged mockery. I simply stepped away from the polished wooden podium, leaving the greasy, severed brake line resting next to the microphone, where the entire world could continue to see the physical proof of my attempted murder. My fractured ribs screamed in absolute burning agony with every single movement as I descended the stage stairs. But I kept my posture perfectly rigid. I refused to show a single ounce of physical weakness in front of the people who had conspired to bury me. I walked directly toward Vaughn, the sea of terrified elites, corrupt city politicians, and stunned mega-church donors, parting for me just as they had rapidly parted for him. I came to a stop, standing firmly shoulder to shoulder with the man whose software empire had been ruthlessly stolen to fund my parents' holy embezzlement. Vaughn did not look away from the stage, but I felt the subtle shift in his stance, a silent, heavy acknowledgement of our unified front. The massive federal presence securing the exits behind us had completely neutralized any physical threat from the church deacons, allowing the cold, hard truth to finally crush the remaining lies. Preston was still smirking down at us, desperately clinging to his manufactured delusion of safety. He wiped a thick layer of cold sweat from his pale forehead and repeated his threat loudly, declaring that his high-priced international defense attorneys would completely destroy the FBI and bury my stolen flash drive in procedural motions for the next decade. He screamed that the legal concept of fruit of the poisonous tree would keep him out of federal prison because unauthorized digital theft was entirely inadmissible in any United States court. He puffed out his chest, demanding the federal agents back away because his newly purchased diplomatic immunity made him legally untouchable. I let his frantic, desperate words hang in the tense, heavy air for a long moment, letting the absolute silence magnify his impending destruction. The federal agents standing at the exits remained perfectly still, their hands resting casually on their tactical belts, waiting for my ultimate signal. I looked up at the elevated stage and told Preston that his elite defense lawyers were going to be completely useless to him because he was operating under a fundamentally flawed assumption. He had assumed that I was just a low-level corporate compliance auditor, desperately hacking into restricted church servers in the middle of the night, acting out of pure bitter jealousy against my sister. I watched the smug, arrogant satisfaction on his sweating face begin to crack and falter as I prepared to dismantle his final line of defense. I took another step forward, my voice projecting with chilling clarity across the hushed, massive ballroom. I told him that I did not break into the Sterling Family Foundation primary server, and I did not commit corporate espionage to obtain his hidden financial ledgers. I revealed the massive twist that had been building in the shadows for months. I announced that exactly 6 months ago, the Securities and Exchange Commission had quietly approached me. Federal investigators had already noticed massive, unexplainable discrepancies in the regional diversity grants being awarded to his fraudulent tech initiative, but they desperately needed someone on the inside. They needed a financial expert with deep authorized internal access to trace the complex money laundering labyrinth through the church accounts without triggering any alarms or destroying digital evidence. I explained to the paralyzed crowd that I was not just the invisible, unloved daughter crunching numbers in a windowless basement office. I had been officially promoted and sworn in as a federal task force liaison for the SEC, working directly with the Financial Crimes Division. The absolute silence in the room deepened into a suffocating, freezing vacuum as the devastating weight of my words processed in Preston's rapidly calculating mind. I told him that my legal jurisdiction over his corporate files was absolute. Every single bank statement, every offshore routing number, and every piece of high-definition security footage currently glowing on the massive LED screens above him had been gathered through a fully authorized, federally sanctioned sting operation. There was no fruit of the poisonous tree because I was the federal tree and my roots were planted firmly in authorized government warrants. Wallace and Vivian let out simultaneous gasps of raw, unfiltered horror from their pathetic spot on the stage floor. My mother physically dropped the crumpled financial ledgers she had been frantically trying to stuff into her ruined designer purse. They finally understood that the scapegoat daughter they had treated like a burden their entire lives had actually been a high-level federal informant, actively building an airtight RICO case against them, while they were busy planning luxury vacations and fiercely protecting their golden child. I looked directly at my terrified parents and explained that the senior audit meeting they had tried to prevent by having my brakes violently severed was never just a standard quarterly financial review. It was the officially scheduled handover of the final federal indictments to the Justice Department. The color drained completely from my father's sweating face as he realized the absolute magnitude of their failure. Preston had committed a violent, documented attempted murder simply to stop a meeting that was already a coordinated federal trap. I looked back at Preston and told him that his fake diplomatic immunity meant absolutely nothing because the federal warrants for his immediate arrest had been signed and sealed by a federal judge weeks before his purchased sovereign ambassadorship ever cleared customs. His ironclad contingency plan was nothing more than a useless piece of expensive paper drafted by lawyers who had no idea they were already completely outmaneuvered by the federal government. Preston gripped the edge of the audio-visual console, his knuckles turning stark white under the harsh stage lights. His chest heaved aggressively as he frantically tried to calculate a new exit strategy, but there were 0 moves left on the board. His private armed security team was kneeling in zip ties, His loyal congregation was actively giving witness statements to the FBI agents, and the man he had ruthlessly stolen his initial wealth from was standing right in front of him, ready to reclaim his empire. Preston tried to speak, tried to formulate another arrogant legal threat, but his voice cracked into a pathetic, desperate wheeze. He stammered wildly, insisting that his offshore accounts were impenetrable, that the blind trusts were protected by strict international banking privacy laws, and that the federal investigators could never definitively tie his personal name to the original church wire transfers without a cooperating witness from the inside of the bank. I turned my body slightly toward Vaughn and reached into the deep inside pocket of my tailored black suit jacket. My bruised, trembling fingers bypassed the empty space where the silver flash drive used to be and closed around a neatly folded piece of thick, heavy, watermarked paper. I pulled the official document out and smoothed the creases with careful, deliberate movements, ensuring the entire room was watching my hands. I looked back up at Preston, who was now visibly shaking violently, his expensive suit plastered to his body with fear sweat. I told him he was absolutely right about one thing in his frantic legal assessment. The FBI did need an inside witness to legally crack the highly encrypted offshore trusts and trace the stolen software equity directly back to his personal bank accounts. He had desperately needed a human shield to protect his stolen money, just like he had tried to use ebony as a physical shield moments earlier. I handed the folded document directly to Vaughn, who took it with a slow, lethal smile spreading across his handsome face. His black leather jacket creaked softly in the quiet room as he unfolded the heavy paper. I announced to the completely silent ballroom that the paper was a fully authenticated, signed legal confession from Preston's primary offshore banker in the Cayman Islands. I explained that my federal task force had successfully flipped his most trusted financial asset, identifying his banking vulnerabilities and securing the complete unredacted confession just 4 hours ago, finalizing the ultimate checkmate. The heavy watermarked paper, resting in Vaughn's black leather glove, was the final undeniable nail in Preston's meticulously crafted coffin. I stood shoulder to shoulder with the man whose empire had been stolen, watching as Preston's pale eyes darted wildly from the physical written confession to the grim, unforgiving faces of the federal agents securing the stage perimeter. His chest was heaving with rapid, shallow breaths, as his highly calculating mind frantically searched for a hidden loophole, a procedural technicality, or a convenient scapegoat to absorb this catastrophic legal blow. The absolute terrifying certainty that his impenetrable Cayman Island accounts had been fully breached completely shattered his arrogant facade. He was no longer the untouchable, brilliant venture capitalist protected by elite international lawyers and purchased sovereign immunity. He was just a cornered, terrified man staring down the barrel of decades in a maximum security federal prison, and his primal survival instinct violently overrode whatever microscopic shred of loyalty he ever held for my family. Preston aggressively shoved himself away from the polished audio-visual console, his expensive torn midnight blue suit practically drenched in cold fear sweat. He pointed a shaking manic finger directly down at Wallace and Vivian, who were still huddled pathetically on the stage floorboards, frantically trying to conceal their ruined financial ledgers. "It was them!" Preston screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with sheer, unhinged desperation. His manufactured, charming southern drawl was completely gone, replaced by the shrill, terrified pitch of a coward, desperately trying to save his own skin. He frantically gestured toward the heavily armed FBI agents, pleading with them to look down at the cowering pastors. They orchestrated the entire massive fraud. He yelled, his chest heaving as he threw my parents directly into the path of the federal investigation. I was just a consultant helping their church manage its regional diversity grants. They were the ones actively funneling their own congregations' hard-earned donations into those offshore trusts. Wallace demanded the complex money laundering structure and Vivian forced me to secure the fake ghost vendors. I am just an innocent financial advisor who got ruthlessly manipulated by their corrupt holy empire. The sheer audacity of his cowardly betrayal sent a violent collective shockwave through the remaining trapped guests, who were still huddled against the locked oak doors. But the reaction from the wooden stage floorboards was one of absolute unfiltered chaos. Vivian, who had spent her entire adult life meticulously cultivating the flawless image of a graceful, untouchable spiritual matriarch, completely snapped under the crushing weight of Preston's treacherous public accusation. The quiet psychological break I had witnessed moments earlier instantly mutated into a violent, explosive feral rage. She scrambled up from her hands and knees, her ruined emerald silk designer dress tearing even further against a stray nail protruding from the stage. She lunged blindly toward a discarded cocktail table near the edge of the platform, her shaking manicured hands closing tightly around a heavy crystal wine glass that had been abandoned during the initial stampede. "You lying parasitic snake!" Vivian shrieked, her voice completely unrecognizable and dripping with pure absolute venom. She drew her arm back and violently hurled the heavy crystal glass directly at Preston's head with every ounce of strength she possessed. The heavy glass narrowly missed his sweating face and shattered aggressively against the massive lead screen behind him, showering the glowing digital display of their undeniable financial crimes with thousands of glittering sharp fragments. "You are a white devil who ruined my entire family!" she roared, her perfectly styled expensive hair completely undone and falling wildly around her contorted, furious face. "We gave you our sacred blessing, we gave you our beautiful golden daughter, and we gave you the keys to our untouchable kingdom, and you bled us dry just to build your own filthy, fragile empire." Vivian was practically foaming at the mouth, aggressively trying to launch herself up the short wooden stairs to physically attack the man she had proudly flaunted as her ultimate success story just hours ago. Two massive federal agents immediately stepped forward, grabbing her flailing arms and firmly restraining her as she continued to thrash and scream vitriolic, hateful insults at the terrified venture capitalist. Wallace witnessed his wife's aggressive physical arrest and Preston's ruthless, desperate betrayal and immediately realized that anger and violence were only accelerating their impending incarceration. The seasoned, manipulative megachurch pastor instantly reverted to the only defensive survival strategy he had ever truly mastered, which was theatrical spiritual manipulation. He completely ignored his thrashing, screaming wife and the dangerous, shattered crystal raining down on the polished stage. Instead, he dropped heavily onto his knees right in the exact center of the wooden platform. He clasped his trembling hands tightly together in a desperate, exaggerated posture of prayer, bowing his head and letting out a loud, theatrical, echoing sob that reverberated hollowly through the massive ballroom speakers. "Please, Lord, forgive this terrible earthly misunderstanding," Wallace wailed, forcing heavy artificial tears to stream rapidly down his sweating, sagging cheeks. He crawled forward on his knees toward the lead FBI agent, holding his clasped hands out in a pathetic display of manufactured absolute humility. "I am just a simple, humble man of God," he begged, his voice trembling with practiced, highly calibrated pastoral grief. "I only ever wanted to expand our holy healing ministry and help the poor lost souls of this city. This wicked corporate shark ruthlessly deceived us." He wept, pointing a shaking, dramatic finger up at Preston for the federal authorities to see. "He came into our sacred, trusting sanctuary cloaked in sheep's clothing and entirely misled my innocent, trusting heart. I did not understand the complex secular financial documents he aggressively forced me to sign in the dark. I am a tragic victim of his wicked worldly greed. Please, you must have mercy on a humble pastor who is only trying to do the Lord's difficult work." I stood perfectly still next to Vaughn, ignoring the burning, agonizing throb of my shattered ribs as I watched the absolute pathetic destruction of the Sterling family legacy unfold in real time. The powerful, untouchable people who had coldly demanded my silent, convenient death in a lonely hospital bed were now aggressively tearing each other to bloody shreds under the blinding, glaring white light of the federal spotlight. Preston was desperately screaming that Wallace was a manipulative, holy mastermind. Vivian was furiously shrieking that Preston was a parasitic devil who ruined them. Wallace was loudly weeping that he was a naive, innocent spiritual victim. They were completely consumed by their own toxic, selfish desperation, frantically trying to sacrifice one another just to escape the massive, crushing legal consequences of their shared, boundless greed. The rotten foundation of their luxurious, perfect existence had completely collapsed, leaving behind only a pathetic, scrambling pile of screaming, betraying cowards. Vaughn slowly turned his head to look down at me, his dark, intense eyes reflecting the cold, satisfying absolute justice of the chaotic, noisy scene. The lead FBI agent simply stared down at Wallace's theatrical weeping with an expression of pure, unadulterated bureaucratic disgust. The tall agent raised his hand and silently signaled to his tactical team, and a sharp, heavy metallic rattle echoed through the tense, suffocating air of the ballroom. The federal agents simultaneously pulled heavy steel handcuffs from their dark tactical belts, stepping firmly onto the wooden stage to officially and permanently secure Preston Wallace and Vivian. The physical restraint of my lifelong abusers was finally imminent and absolute. But as the cold, heavy steel clicked loudly shut around my father's shaking wrists, my gaze shifted slowly away from the elevated stage and scanned across the chaotic, ruined floor of the grand ballroom. My pulse slowed, and a new, heavy, freezing determination settled deep in my bruised chest. The primary architects of my attempted murder and financial ruin were finally in custody, facing absolute destruction. But there was still one more person in this massive room who desperately needed to be held fully accountable before the night was truly over. The sharp metallic clicks of heavy steel handcuffs, echoing across the wooden stage, finally broke the remaining spell of the room. Preston Wallace and Vivian were physically secured, their absolute destruction now a permanent legal reality. The federal agents began reading them their rights, the bureaucratic drone of the Miranda warning contrasting sharply with my mother's continued frantic sobbing. I stood beside Vaughn, watching the three architects of my misery being hauled to their feet like common street criminals. They looked pathetic, stripped of their expensive tailored armor and holy righteousness. But as the agents began to march them toward the shattered oak doors, a sudden, desperate movement caught my eye from the far corner of the stage. Ebony had been sitting entirely paralyzed amid the scattered financial ledgers and broken crystal shards. She had watched her husband turn into a rabid animal and her parents cannibalize each other without lifting a single finger to intervene. Now she realized with absolute terrifying clarity that the federal net was closing, and she was the only one left standing, without steel bracelets on her wrists. The illusion of her untouchable golden child status was evaporating right in front of her. She scrambled up from the dirty floorboards, her torn emerald silk gown dragging heavily behind her as she blindly rushed toward me. She stumbled twice over the discarded microphone cords, but kept coming, her face a twisted mask of pure desperation. She crashed into me before Vaughn could intercept her, throwing her arms around my neck and burying her tear-streaked face into the shoulder of my suit jacket. She was shaking violently, her entire body trembling with loud, hysterical sobs that sounded like a wounded child. "Sydney, please," she wept loudly, clinging to my lapels with a desperate, white-knuckled grip. "You have to tell them I had absolutely nothing to do with any of this. You have to save me." Her voice was high and thin, a pathetic, frantic whine that begged for salvation. She looked up at me, her perfectly styled hair ruined, and her expensive makeup running down her pale cheeks in dark, thick streaks. She launched into a rapid, breathless monologue painting a tragic masterpiece of her own innocence. She cried that she was just a naive, obedient wife who had been ruthlessly manipulated by a toxic, sociopathic husband. She claimed Preston controlled all the bank accounts and forced her to sign digital documents without ever letting her read them. She turned her weeping gaze toward our parents being escorted out and blamed them entirely for grooming her to be a silent, pretty accessory. "They traded me to him like a piece of valuable property, Sydney," she sobbed, gripping my arms tighter. "They used my marriage to secure his dirty money, and I was just trapped in the middle of their greedy, holy empire. I had no idea they were hurting you or stealing from the church. I am a victim too." I stood perfectly still, letting her cry into my shoulder. The heavy federal presence in the room faded into background noise as I looked down at my weeping little sister. For one brief, fleeting fraction of a second, I actually felt a tiny, familiar pang of pity deep in my bruised chest. She was the beautiful, pampered golden child who had never been forced to develop a spine or a moral compass because our parents had always shielded her from consequence. She was weak and fragile and completely unequipped to handle the harsh, brutal reality of the real world. A tiny part of the older sister I used to be wanted to put my arms around her and tell the federal agents to let her go home. But that older sister had died bleeding and terrified in a crushed sedan at the bottom of a concrete parking garage. The cold, sharp reality of the evidence I had personally uncovered during my Sikh investigation instantly killed whatever microscopic trace of pity I had left. I reached up and firmly grabbed Ebony's wrists, peeling her desperate, trembling hands off my dark suit jacket. I took a deliberate step backward, severing our physical connection and leaving her standing alone under the harsh white stage lights. My expression was completely blank, an impassive mask of cold federal authority, as I reached into the inside pocket of my portfolio folder that Vaughn had retrieved from the audio-visual console. I pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of thick premium paper. It was not a bank ledger or a blurry security photo. It was a highly classified digital authorization form printed directly from the secure offshore Cayman Islands banking portal. I slowly unfolded the paper and held it up right in front of Ebony's tear-stained face, ensuring she could clearly see the crisp black ink and the undeniable digital signature at the very bottom of the page. The hysterical sobbing died in her throat, instantly replaced by a sharp, suffocating gasp of pure terror as she recognized the document. I kept my voice dead and completely devoid of any sisterly affection as I read the details of the transfer authorization aloud to her. I explained that this specific document authorized the immediate unretractable transfer of $25 million from the Sterling Charity Fund directly into Preston's hidden sovereign account. But the money was not the most damning part of the paper. I moved my bruised finger to tap the exact digital timestamp printed next to her authorized signature. I told her to look very closely at the date and the exact minute she had approved the massive financial transaction. The timestamp was registered exactly 42 minutes after the police had officially called my parents to notify them of my catastrophic car crash. I stared directly into Ebony's wide, terrified eyes and dismantled her entire victim narrative piece by piece. "You knew, Ebony?" I said, my voice echoing like ice in the quiet space. "You knew the brakes had been sabotaged, and you knew I was actively bleeding out in an emergency room trauma center, fighting for every single breath with a punctured lung." Preston needed a secondary authorized family signature to release the final charity funds before the federal audit could freeze the accounts. You stood in your massive luxury kitchen knowing your older sister was dying, and you consciously, deliberately chose to log into the portal and sign the money away. The absolute, undeniable truth hit her like a physical execution. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She could not blame a toxic husband or greedy parents for a digital signature she had typed with her own hands, while fully aware of my attempted murder. She had not been a naive bystander. She had weighed the value of my life against $25 million and happily chosen the offshore payout. Her knees finally gave out and she sank slowly to the wooden stage floorboards, her emerald dress pooling around her like a dark green shadow. The golden child was completely broken, her beautiful innocent facade shattered into a million unfixable pieces. I looked down at the pathetic weeping woman on the floor and felt absolutely nothing. The final thread tying me to the Sterling family was permanently severed. I turned my head and gave a slight nod to the tall female FBI agent who had been standing patiently near the edge of the stage, waiting for my signal. The agent stepped forward, her heavy tactical boots thudding against the wood, drawing a pair of cold steel handcuffs from her dark belt. I stepped aside, clearing the path for federal justice to claim the last remaining piece of my abusive past. I looked down at my sister one last time as the agent yanked her arms behind her back. "You were not a victim, Ebony. You were a willing participant. Enjoy the diversity of a federal prison." The sharp, heavy click of the steel cuffs securing Ebony's wrists echoed through the silent ballroom, acting as the final devastating trigger for Vivian's complete psychological collapse. She watched her precious golden child, the daughter she had meticulously groomed from birth to be a flawless, untouchable accessory, being roughly hauled to her feet by a female federal agent. Vivian could not process the sight of her perfect creation being treated like a common street criminal. She began to thrash violently against the two massive agents holding her arms, her ruined emerald silk dress tearing further along the seams as she desperately tried to break free from their iron grip. Her perfectly styled hair was a wild, tangled mess around her face, and her expensive makeup was smeared into dark, ugly shadows beneath her manic eyes. When she realized she could not reach Ebony, her gaze snapped directly to me standing quietly beside Vaughn. The sheer, unadulterated hatred burning in my mother's eyes was a physical force that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the massive room. She spat in my direction, her face contorting into a hideous mask of pure, unfiltered venom. "You malicious, jealous little parasite," she shrieked, her voice scraping against the walls like shattered glass. "You have spent your entire pathetic life resenting this family, resenting your beautiful sister, and resenting the massive, untouchable empire we built from nothing." She strained against the agents, her heels scraping uselessly against the polished floorboards as she tried to launch herself at my throat. "You destroyed us because you could never be us, Sydney. We were building generations of untouchable Black excellence. We were creating a dynasty of absolute wealth and power that would have cemented the sterling name in history books, and you burned it all down out of pure, bitter spite." I stood perfectly still, letting her vitriolic words wash over me. The federal agents tightened their grip on her arms, dragging her backward, but she refused to stop screaming. She cursed the very day I was born, declaring loudly to the stunned ballroom that I was a mistake, a curse sent to test her faith and ruin her perfect bloodline. She claimed that I was a miserable, unremarkable federal informant who could not stand witnessing the extraordinary success of my own flesh and blood. She yelled that the federal government would eventually release them because their influence was too vast and their connections too deep, but that I would die alone and unloved with nothing but my bitter jealousy to keep me warm. The ballroom was completely silent, aside from her deranged screaming. The corrupt city council members and frightened investors watched in absolute horror as the elegant, untouchable matriarch of the Sterling family revealed the ugly, rotting monster hiding beneath her designer clothes. Vaughn shifted his weight beside me, his jaw clenched tight, but he did not intervene. He knew this was my battle to finish and my burden to unload. My broken ribs burned with a dull, agonizing ache, but my mind had never been clearer. I slowly closed the distance between us, stepping calmly into my mother's personal space. The two federal agents held her firmly in place, allowing me to stand just inches from the woman who had happily authorized my violent murder. I looked deep into her manic, terrified eyes, my expression completely devoid of any emotion. The cold, dead silence stretching between us finally forced her to stop screaming. Her chest heaved rapidly as she stared back at me, desperately searching for any sign of weakness or hesitation, but she found absolutely nothing. "You did not build Black excellence, Mother," I whispered, my voice low and terrifyingly calm, carrying perfectly through the hushed room. "You did not build a dynasty or a legacy or anything resembling true power. You built a plantation." Her eyes widened in shock as my words struck her, but I did not let her look away. You built a plantation and you happily handed Preston the whip." I continued, systematically dismantling her entire delusion piece by piece. "You let a sociopathic corporate thief steal from your own congregation, you let him siphon the hard-earned donations of poor, desperate people, and you let him arrange the bloody murder of your own daughter. You sold out your blood, your faith, and your community just so you could wear Chanel and sip expensive wine with corrupt politicians. You traded your soul for a comfortable seat in a velvet chair, and you convinced yourself it was a holy throne." I let the devastating weight of my words crush the last remaining breath from her lungs. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly, as the absolute, undeniable truth of her pathetic existence finally shattered her manufactured reality. I leaned in just a fraction closer, ensuring she heard my final judgment. "I did not destroy this family, Mother," I said, my tone dripping with freezing finality. "I just turned on the lights." Vivian seemed to physically deflate her entire body, going completely limp in the arms of the federal agents. The fight completely left her, replaced by the crushing, suffocating realization that she was entirely exposed to the world. The agents did not give her time to recover. They immediately began dragging her toward the shattered oak doors, her ruined designer shoes dragging uselessly across the polished marble floor. As they pulled her away, Wallace scrambled forward on his knees, the heavy steel cuffs clinking loudly against his sweating wrists. His theatrical pastoral weeping had stopped, completely replaced by a raw, pathetic desperation that made my skin crawl. He awkwardly shuffled toward me, his sagging face covered in cold, terrified sweat. "Sydney, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, frantic whine. "You cannot just abandon us like this to the federal authorities. We are your parents. We gave you life. You have to come see us in prison. You have to visit us. We can explain everything. We can make this right as a family if you just give us a chance." He was pleading for a lifeline, grasping blindly for any microscopic shred of familial loyalty he could exploit to lessen the absolute terror of his impending long-term incarceration. He begged me to remember the good times, to remember the church, to remember my holy duty as a loyal daughter. I looked down at the pathetic, broken man kneeling on the floorboards. This was the powerful, arrogant mega-church pastor who had coldly instructed Preston to handle the federal audit problem, regardless of the human cost. This was the greedy father who had traded my life for offshore bank accounts and private luxury jets. The emotional tether that had tied me to him for over 30 years was completely and utterly dissolved, leaving nothing but a profound, chilling emptiness in my chest. I held his desperate, pleading gaze for a long, terrible moment, letting the heavy silence stretch out until the federal agent stepped forward to roughly haul him to his feet. "Call me if you die," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any human warmth. I did not wait to see his reaction or hear his final pathetic sobs. I simply turned my back on him, severing the final toxic thread of the Sterling family legacy forever. I walked slowly back toward Vaughn, the sharp pain in my ribs fading into the background as a profound, overwhelming sense of true freedom washed through my entire body. Vaughn offered me a subtle nod of deep mutual respect, falling into step beside me as we navigated through the sea of cowering elites and armed federal agents. The blinding red and blue lights of the police cruisers waiting outside painted the shattered ballroom in a chaotic, rhythmic pulse. I did not look back at the screaming, weeping wreckage of the people who had conspired to bury me. I simply stepped over the splintered wood of the broken doors, leaving the darkness behind me, and walking directly out into the cool, clean air of the long night ahead. The shattered oak doors of the Grand Hotel ballroom gave way to the cool, humid embrace of the Atlanta night. I stepped through the destroyed entryway, leaving the suffocating air of panic and ruined billionaires behind me. The transition from the chaotic, noisy interior to the sprawling concrete courtyard felt like crossing the boundary between two completely different universes. Outside the world was a dizzying, rhythmic ocean of flashing emergency lights. Dozens of police cruisers, unmarked federal vehicles, and bright yellow ambulances were parked aggressively across the manicured hotel driveway, their rotating red and blue strobes painting the pristine white columns of the hotel in harsh, aggressive colors. I slowly peeled off the heavy dark suit jacket I had worn to conceal the federal wiretaps and dropped it onto a nearby stone bench, revealing the striking, vibrant red suit I wore underneath. The bright crimson fabric caught the chaotic, flashing lights of the police barricade, making me look like a living, breathing ember, standing victorious among the ashes of the Sterling family empire. I stood alone on the grand, sweeping steps of the hotel entrance, watching the meticulously coordinated federal takedown conclude. Heavily armed agents were actively marching the arrogant, corrupt elites down the marble stairs, securing them into the back of armored transport vans. I watched the elite investors who had laughed at my supposed failure being forced to lower their heads to avoid the glaring news cameras that had already arrived at the perimeter. I saw the unmistakable ruined emerald silk of my mother's dress as she was shoved into the back of a federal vehicle, her sobbing completely drowned out by the harsh blare of police sirens. Preston's private security team was being loaded into a separate transport van, their hands securely zip-tied behind their backs. My pulse was finally beginning to slow down, replacing the frantic adrenaline of the sting operation with a deep, heavy exhaustion that seeped into my very bones. The night air was thick and clean, washing away the cloying scent of my parents, expensive hypocrisy, and Preston's cold, fierce sweat. The heavy, familiar thud of thick leather boots sounded against the stone steps behind me. I did not have to turn around to know who it was. Vaughn walked out of the wreckage of the ballroom and came to a halt right beside me, his broad shoulders relaxing for the first time since he had breached the stage. He stood silently matching my gaze as we both stared out over the flashing sea of federal justice. The chaotic energy of the police radios and the barking orders of the tactical commanders faded into background noise. We shared a long, quiet moment of absolute, profound mutual respect. We were two people who had been violently stripped of our life's work, two people who had been coldly left for dead by greedy sociopaths. But instead of quietly fading into the shadows and accepting our defeats, we had crawled through the dirt, sharpened our minds into lethal weapons, and completely dismantled our abusers from the inside out. Vaughn did not offer a meaningless platitude or a dramatic congratulation. He simply stood shoulder to shoulder with me, acknowledging that the war we had waged in the shadows was officially and permanently won. The night breeze rustled the collar of his signature black leather jacket as he slowly turned his head to look at me. His dark eyes were calm, stripped of the cold, lethal vengeance that had consumed him for the past 5 years. His software firm was finally his again. The massive corporate locks Preston had placed on his proprietary algorithms were already being dismantled by federal cyber agents. The stolen equity was being routed back into his legitimate accounts. Vaughn looked at my bruised face and the defiant crimson red of my suit, and he spoke with a quiet, undeniable authority. He told me that his recovered servers and raw code were secure, but the financial infrastructure of his reclaimed empire was a massive, chaotic graveyard of shell companies and offshore ledgers. He said he did not want to waste years trying to clean up the financial slaughterhouse Preston had left behind. He needed someone who could instantly identify corporate rot and purge it without hesitation. He shifted his stance slightly, turning his full attention toward me. He did not offer me a job, and he did not offer me a generic executive role. Vaughn looked me directly in the eyes and offered me a permanent high-ranking partnership in his newly reclaimed global firm. He told me that he needed a financial mastermind who could navigate the most complex corporate labyrinths in the world. He needed an apex predator who understood compliance auditing and corporate warfare better than anyone else in the industry. He offered me full equity, complete operational autonomy, and a position at the absolute top of the corporate food chain. His voice was steady and serious, laying out the terms of a massive global enterprise that would easily dominate the international tech sector. He made it incredibly clear that he was not looking for an employee to manage his books, but an equal partner to help him conquer the entire market. I looked back out at the flashing police lights illuminating the dark Atlanta sky, analyzing the massive weight of his proposal. A year ago, I would have wept with gratitude at such a massive opportunity. I would have frantically thanked him for recognizing my potential and begged him to teach me how to lead. But the weak, desperate woman who craved validation was dead. The woman standing on those stone steps was a federal task force liaison who had just flawlessly executed a $25 million sting operation, bringing down a corrupt megachurch and a fraudulent venture capital firm in a single night. I did not feel a single ounce of overwhelming gratitude because I knew with absolute cold certainty that I was not being given a handout. I was being offered a partnership because Vaughn knew my mind was a terrifying, unstoppable asset that he desperately wanted on his side of the boardroom table. I possessed the legal jurisdiction, the federal connections, and the absolute brilliant financial ruthlessness required to secure his legacy. I turned back to him, maintaining fierce, unbroken eye contact, and I accepted his offer. My voice was calm and perfectly steady, sealing the massive corporate alliance, not out of thankfulness, but out of the pure, undeniable knowledge that I had brutally earned every single piece of it. As the terms of our new empire settled into the cool night air, the last remnants of my survival, adrenaline finally completely evaporated. The sudden absence of the chemical rush allowed my broken, battered body to register its true condition. A sharp, sudden spike of pure, burning agony shot through my right side, originating from the rib that Preston had shattered during the violent car crash. My breath hitched sharply, and I instinctively brought my hand up, pressing my palm firmly against my bruised, aching ribs. The pain was intense, a freezing, suffocating throb that forced me to brace myself against the heavy stone railing of the stairs. But as I stood there gripping my side, surrounded by the flashing red and blue lights of the police barricades, the agonizing pain did not feel like a tragic reminder of my victimization. It did not make me want to cry or retreat back into the shadows. Instead, the harsh, burning ache radiating through my chest felt like an absolute glorious badge of honor. It was the physical, undeniable proof that I had survived a targeted assassination and walked straight through the blazing fire to deliver my own terrifying justice. I closed my eyes, holding my hand against my broken ribs, lifting my chin toward the dark sky, and inhaled a deep, slow breath of the cool Atlanta night, filling my lungs with the intoxicating, completely limitless air of total absolute freedom. The Atlanta skyline stretched out endlessly, beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass of my new corner office. A glittering sea of steel and ambition, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon sun. Exactly 365 days had passed since I walked out of that shattered ballroom, and every single hour since then had been dedicated to building an absolute fortress. I stood behind a massive, polished obsidian desk, reviewing a complex risk assessment portfolio for a Fortune 500 tech client. Across the sleek minimalist room, Vaughn sat on a low leather sofa, running financial algorithms on his tablet. The air between us was no longer thick with shared trauma or desperate survival, but with the quiet, humming energy of total dominance. We had taken the ashes of our stolen work and forged the most elite corporate compliance and risk management firm in the entire Southeast. We were no longer victims scrambling in the dark. We were the apex predators that corrupt executives checked under their beds for. Every major corporation in the city knew our names, and they knew that if our firm was auditing their books, there was absolutely nowhere to hide their dirty secrets. A large flat-screen monitor mounted on the far wall was playing the local evening news on a low volume. The anchor was standing outside the federal courthouse, her expression serious as she delivered the final legal conclusion to the Sterling family collapse. I set down my pen and turned my full attention to the broadcast, letting the undeniable reality of absolute justice wash over me. The federal judge had shown absolutely no mercy to the architects of my attempted murder. Preston received a mandatory 25-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the slightest possibility of early parole. His sovereign citizen defense had been laughed out of court, and his elite international lawyers had abandoned him, the second his offshore accounts were completely seized and liquidated. Wallace and Vivian, the holy power couple, who had ruthlessly traded their own daughter for a Chanel wardrobe and a private jet, were both handed harsh 15-year sentences. The anchor detailed how my parents had wept openly in the courtroom, begging the judge to consider their charitable contributions. But the relentless federal prosecutor had successfully argued that their entire charity was nothing but a bloody money laundering operation built on fraud and attempted homicide. And then there was Ebony. The broadcast displayed a courtroom sketch of my little sister looking pale and entirely stripped of her golden child arrogance. She received a 5-year sentence in a minimum security federal prison. The judge specifically noted her direct complicity in authorizing the financial transfer while fully aware of my catastrophic car crash. She would spend the rest of her youth wearing a standard-issue uniform, completely cut off from the luxury and endless privilege she had happily condemned me to die for. The news segment shifted to a live shot of the massive Sterling megachurch. The giant stained glass windows and opulent gold-trimmed doors were still intact, but the Sterling name had been permanently sandblasted off the white marble facade. The federal government had seized the entire sprawling property and completely repurposed it, transferring ownership to a local grassroots coalition. They had successfully turned the massive building into a genuine community center. The halls that were once used to siphon donations from desperate believers were now actively providing free health clinics, job placement services, and a massive food bank for the city. The wealth they had stolen was finally being returned to the people they had exploited. Vaughn looked up from his tablet, his dark eyes catching mine across the quiet expanse of the office. He did not smile, and he did not offer a celebratory cheer, because we both knew this was simply the inevitable mathematics of consequence. He gave me a single subtle nod of deep mutual respect, before returning his focus entirely to his business algorithms. He was a brilliant partner who understood that the best way to honor our violent survival was to continue expanding our corporate empire. I turned away from the screen and walked slowly toward the massive glass window, looking down at the bustling streets of Atlanta, far below. The dull, agonizing ache in my ribs was completely gone, leaving behind only a smooth, faint scar that I carried as a quiet, permanent badge of honor. I looked past the sprawling city and stared directly into my own reflection in the thick glass, letting my gaze pierce through the barrier to speak directly to anyone listening who might be trapped in the same suffocating darkness I had just escaped. I know exactly what it feels like to be the sacrificial lamb for people who share your blood. I know the heavy, crushing weight of trying to desperately earn love from parents who view you as nothing more than a disposable financial asset. Society constantly tells you that family is sacred and that bloodlines demand absolute unconditional loyalty, no matter how toxic the relationship becomes. They tell you to forgive the unforgivable and to quietly absorb the abuse just to keep the peace at the holiday dinner table. But the sweet, quiet peace of ultimate revenge is realizing that your loyalty belongs only to yourself and to those who actively prove they deserve your presence. You do not owe your abuser a comfortable life just because you share a genetic history. Cutting off toxic bloodlines is not a failure of forgiveness. It is the ultimate act of radical self-preservation and personal empowerment. You must strip away the guilt and recognize your absolute undeniable worth in a world that tries to diminish you. If your family treats you like a stepping stone, become the rock that breaks their glass houses. You have the sheer power to dismantle the false reality they built around you and step into a future entirely defined by your own brilliant terms. If you are watching this from somewhere where family drama hits close to home, and you have ever felt abandoned or betrayed by the people who should have protected you, take a moment to like and subscribe. You are not alone in this fight, and your worth is never determined by their failure to recognize it. Share your own experiences of setting difficult boundaries with family members in the comments below. Do not forget to like and subscribe if this story resonated with you and helps you find the courage to cut toxic ties. Your story matters and ultimate freedom is always possible.